When my father drew his last breath, my older siblings were nowhere to be found. But the moment it was time to read his will, they showed up in designer suits expecting millions. They left me standing in the mud at a rundown Detroit cemetery, holding a $12,500 funeral bill I could not pay while they skied in Aspen. "Handle it yourself," they told me. "You were the one who wanted to play nurse." They thought I was the family loser. They thought they had won. But when my father's attorney opened that leather folder and named me the sole heir to an estate they had already spent in their heads, their arrogant smiles vanished instantly. What they did not know was that the real inheritance was not just money. It was a perfectly laid trap, and they had just walked right into it. The rain in suburban Detroit did not just fall. It felt like it was trying to punish me. I stood shivering in a cheap, ill-fitting black suit I had bought off a clearance rack 5 years ago. My boots were sinking 2 inches deep into the cold, unforgiving mud of the cemetery. I had just come off a grueling 14-hour night shift working as a paramedic. My hands still smelled of latex gloves and antiseptic. I was 36 years old, running on 3 hours of sleep, and I was completely alone at my own father's grave. There was no crowd. There was no eulogy. There was only a backhoe waiting in the distance, its engine idling loudly, and Mr. Garvey, the funeral home director, standing impatiently under a massive black golf umbrella. He was not looking at the plain wooden casket suspended over the open plot. He was looking at his portable credit card reader. The screen blinked red. A sharp, obnoxious beep cut through the sound of the pouring rain. Declined. Mr. Garvey sighed, a heavy, exaggerated sound that let me know exactly how much of an inconvenience I was. He wiped a drop of water off the screen and looked up at me with eyes completely devoid of sympathy. "I am sorry, Elias," he said, his tone flat and businesslike, "but the transaction did not go through. That is the third card we have tried. The total balance for the casket, the transport, and the burial plot is $12,500. We cannot lower the casket until the balance is cleared in full. You understand our policy." I stared at the red light on the machine, my stomach twisting into a hard knot. My chest burned. $12,500. To my older brother or my older sister, that was pocket change. It was a weekend vacation. It was a down payment on a new watch. To me, it was a mountain I could not climb. As a night shift paramedic, I barely made enough to keep the heat on in my cramped apartment. Every spare dollar I had earned over the last 3 years had gone straight toward my father's medical bills, his prescription co-pays, and the endless late notices stacked on his kitchen counter. "Try it again," I told Mr. Garvey, my voice cracking against the wind. "Please. Just type the numbers in manually. Maybe the magnetic strip is worn out." He did not move his hand. "The card is maxed out, Elias. We need another form of payment, or I have to tell the crew to take the casket back to our holding facility. We charge $200 a day for cold storage." The sheer brutality of his words hit me like a physical blow. They were going to put my father, Richard Thorne, back into a freezer because his youngest son was a financial failure. My father had spent 40 years of his life running Thorne Transit, a local trucking company that he built with his own 2 hands. He had broken his back to put my older brother and sister through elite universities. But when his health failed and the trucking company began bleeding money, those same children had vanished. I pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked and the battery was at 14%. Raindrops smeared across the glass as I pulled up my contacts. I had promised myself I would not beg them. I had promised my father I would handle this, but looking at the cheap wooden box hovering over the dark mud, my pride completely shattered. I had no other choice. I dialed my older sister, Sarah Thorne Kensington. Sarah was 41, married to a ruthless hedge fund manager named Richard Kensington. She spent her days organizing charity galas she did not actually care about and playing tennis at a country club that cost more per year than my annual salary. The phone rang 4 times. I prayed she would send it to voicemail, but she answered. "Elias," she said, her voice dripping with irritation. I am right in the middle of a luncheon. I told you I would not be able to fly out for this. The weather in Detroit is miserable this time of year, and my sinuses simply cannot handle it. Sarah. I need your help, I said, ignoring her completely fabricated excuses. I am standing at the cemetery right now. They are about to send Dad back to the morgue. The bill is $12,500. My cards are maxed out from his hospital stays. I just need you to wire the funeral home a portion of it. I will pay you back. I swear I will pay you back. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and the polite, hollow laughter of wealthy women in the background. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice dropped an octave, turning cold and calculating. Pay me back. With what, Elias? Your paramedic salary. Please, do not insult my intelligence. We both know you do not have a dime to your name. Sarah, he is our father. He paid for your tuition. He bought you your first house. You cannot just leave him sitting in a freezer. Do not try to guilt-trip me, she snapped. Her tone was like ice. Dad made his choices. He refused to sell that pathetic trucking company when Richard told him to. He stubborned his way into bankruptcy, and you enabled him. You sat there playing the devoted little nurse while his debts piled up. Richard and I are not opening our checkbook to fix your poor financial planning. Before I could say another word, she lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. Look, Elias, you chose to live this blue-collar life. You chose to be the one changing his bedpans. This is your mess. Handle it yourself. I have to go. They are pouring the champagne. The line went dead. The dial tone hissed in my ear, mocking me. I slowly lowered the phone, my hand trembling so violently I could barely hold the device. I looked at Mr. Garvey. He was tapping his shiny leather shoe against a dry patch of concrete, checking his gold watch. Well, he asked. Give me one more minute, I choked out. I swiped down on my phone screen and tapped the name of my older brother, Bradley Thorne. Bradley was 45. He was a high-powered real estate developer who drove a custom Porsche and wore suits that cost more than my car. He was married to Chloe, a woman whose entire personality was based on whatever designer label she was currently wearing. Bradley had not spoken to my father in 3 years, not since my father refused to let him bulldoze the Thorne Transit parking lot to build a commercial strip mall. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Pick up. Please pick up. Yeah, what is it? Bradley barked into the receiver. Behind his voice, I could hear the distinct sound of wind rushing and cheerful voices. He was outside. Bradley. It is Elias, I said, rain pouring down my face, mixing with tears of pure humiliation. I am at the cemetery. Elias, make it quick. Chloe and I are at the ski lodge in Aspen. We are about to hit the slopes before the powder gets ruined. What do you want? The sheer absurdity of his words paralyzed me for a second. My father was lying in a box over an open grave, and my brother was annoyed that I was interrupting his ski trip. I need $12,000 to bury Dad, I blurted out. My chest was heaving. I could not control the desperation in my voice. The funeral home is declining my cards. I am completely tapped out, Brad. I have nothing left. Please, you make that kind of money in a day. Just cover the burial and I will never ask you for anything ever again. Bradley let out a sharp, condescending laugh. It was the same laugh he used when we were kids, the one that meant he had won and I had lost. Are you seriously calling me while I am on vacation to beg for money? He asked. I could hear Chloe in the background asking, Is it him again? Tell him to stop calling us. Bradley covered the mouthpiece for a second, then came back. Listen to me very carefully, Elias. I told you and the old man 5 years ago that Thorne Transit was a sinking ship. I told him to liquidate. But no, he wanted to keep his precious legacy alive. And you were stupid enough to stay there holding his hand. He is your father, I yelled, my voice breaking over the sound of the rain. He gave you everything. He gave me a headache, Bradley shouted back, his anger suddenly flaring. I built my real estate empire myself. Dad was a stubborn old fool who did not know how the real world works. And you are exactly like him. A naive, pathetic loser who thinks playing the good son is going to magically pay the bills. Bradley, please. They are going to take the casket away. They are going to put him in storage. You cannot let this happen. Not my problem, Bradley said coldly. You wanted the glory of being the loyal son. You wanted to be his favorite at the end. Then you pay the tab. I am not throwing my hard-earned money into a hole in the ground just because you cannot manage your life. The call disconnected. I stood there in the pouring rain staring at the black screen of my phone. Not my problem. Those 3 words echoed in my head, slamming into my brain over and over again. My siblings. The people who shared my blood. The people who had taken everything from my father when he was strong and successful had just abandoned his corpse in the mud because it inconvenienced them. Mr. Garvey cleared his throat loudly. I think we are done here, Elias, the funeral director said. He signaled to the 2 groundskeepers standing near the backhoe. Pull it up, boys. We are taking Mr. Thorne back to the facility. No. I stepped forward, stepping right into the deep puddle of mud, blocking the men from reaching the casket. Do not touch him. Elias, do not make this difficult, Garvey warned, stepping back to keep his expensive shoes clean. It is business, nothing personal. You have no money. I reached into my soaking wet jacket pocket and pulled out my paramedic badge. I pulled out the keys to my terrible apartment. I pulled out the title to my rusted sedan. I shoved them all toward Garvey. Take the car, I said, my voice shaking with a rage I had never felt before in my entire life. Take it. It is a Honda. It runs. It is worth at least $3,000. I will sign the title over to you right now. I will sign my future paychecks over to you. I will work for your funeral home washing the floors. I do not care. Just put my father in the ground. Garvey looked at the wet, crumpled piece of paper in my hand and grimaced. He looked at my face, realizing that I was a man pushed entirely past his breaking point. If he tried to move that casket, I was going to fight him right there in the cemetery. He let out a long, frustrated breath. Keep your garbage car, Elias. I will give you exactly 48 hours to secure a high-interest loan and bring a cashier's check to my office. If you do not have the money by Friday morning, I am digging him back up. I have a legal right to reclaim our property. Do we understand each other? I nodded, swallowing the massive lump of bile and humiliation in my throat. I understand. Garvey gestured to the workers. Lower him down. Let us get out of this miserable weather. I stood alone and watched the wooden box slowly descend into the dark earth. The rain hit the wood with a hollow drumming sound. There were no flowers. There was no music. There was only me, completely ruined, completely exhausted, and completely broke. I had sacrificed my 20s, my savings, and my marriage to care for the man in that box, and this was my reward. My knees gave out. I collapsed into the freezing mud, the water soaking right through my dress pants to my skin. I pressed my hands against my face and screamed. I screamed out of frustration. I screamed out of hatred for my brother and sister. I screamed because the world was a cruel, transactional place that only rewarded the greedy and punished anyone who tried to do the right thing. I stayed there on my knees until the groundskeepers finished shoveling the dirt back into the hole. They did not look at me. They packed up their tools and drove the noisy machine away, leaving me alone with a fresh mound of wet, heavy soil. I reached out and placed my freezing, mud-covered hand on the dirt. I am sorry, Dad, I whispered into the wind. I am so sorry I failed you. I am sorry they left you. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt like lead. My suit was ruined. I had no idea how I was going to get $12,500 in 48 hours. My credit was destroyed. The bank would never approve a personal loan for a paramedic already drowning in medical debt. I was staring down a dark, bottomless barrel, and I had absolutely no safety net. I turned around and started the long, agonizing walk back to the cemetery gates where my rusted car was parked. The rain was washing the mud off my hands, but it could not wash away the deep, burning shame inside my chest. I finally reached my car, pulled open the creaking door, and collapsed into the driver's seat. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, gasping for air. I was trying to figure out if I could sell my blood or pick up 5 extra graveyard shifts or go to a payday loan shark who would charge me 300% interest. Before I could turn the key in the ignition, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. I looked down. The screen lit up with a name that made my heart drop straight into my stomach. It was Brenda, my soon-to-be ex-wife. We had been separated for 6 months. She had walked out on me because she was tired of sharing my attention and my meager salary with my sick father. She had told me I was dragging her down. I had not heard her voice in weeks. I stared at the ringing phone. A terrible sense of dread washed over me. The universe had already taken everything from me today. What else could possibly be left to lose? I took a deep breath, wiped the rain off my face, and pressed answer. I stared at the ringing phone in the cup holder of my rusted car. The name Brenda flashed across the cracked glass, glowing brightly in the dim light of the storm. We had been separated for 6 months. She had walked out on our marriage because she refused to share my time, my meager paramedic salary, or my attention with my dying father. She told me I was an anchor dragging her down. I had not heard her voice in weeks. For a brief, foolish second, a wave of desperate hope washed over me. I thought maybe my brother or sister had called her. I thought maybe they had told her about my father passing away, and despite all our bitter fights, she was calling to offer a shred of human decency. I took a deep breath, wiped the cold rain from my face with the back of my sleeve, and pressed answer. Brenda. I said, my voice hoarse and trembling. I am still at the cemetery. My dad is gone. They just put him in the ground. I know, Elias, she replied. Her voice was flat sharp and completely devoid of warmth. Her tone did not carry an ounce of pity. It sounded like she was confirming an appointment at a hair salon. Where exactly are you parked? I am pulling through the main gates right now, and I do not have time to drive around looking for you in this weather. You are here? I asked, genuinely stunned. A small knot of relief formed in my chest. Even after everything, she had driven out into a torrential downpour to find me. I am by the east section near the old oak trees. Look for my Honda. The line clicked dead. 2 minutes later, a sleek silver SUV pulled up and parked diagonally across the narrow asphalt path, boxing my car in. It was a brand new lease one she had acquired right after draining our joint savings account. The driver's side door opened and Brenda stepped out. She popped open a massive designer umbrella, shielding herself perfectly from the rain. She was wearing a pristine white trench coat and high-heeled boots that she carefully navigated around the muddy puddles. She did not look toward the fresh mound of dirt in the distance. She did not offer a comforting glance. Instead, she marched straight up to my driver's side window and tapped aggressively on the glass. I rolled the window down, the freezing wind whipping into the car. Brenda, thank you for coming, I started to say, unbuckling my seatbelt. The funeral home director is threatening to dig him back up if I do not pay $12,000 by Friday. Bradley and Sarah hung up on me. I am entirely out of options. Brenda did not even let me finish. She reached into her expensive leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve to protect it from the rain. She shoved it through the open window, hitting me right in the chest. I do not care about your father, Elias, she said, her eyes narrowing with pure contempt. And I certainly do not care about your petty family drama with Bradley and Sarah. I am here because my lawyer said you have been dodging the process server for 3 days, and I knew this was the one place you would be forced to show your face. I looked down at the heavy stack of legal documents resting on my lap. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, Emergency Petition for Partition and Forced Sale of Marital Asset. My heart stopped beating for a full second. My vision blurred. What is this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It is exactly what it looks like, Brenda snapped. She leaned closer to the window, the rain bouncing off her umbrella. It is a court order forcing the immediate sale of the house. You have ignored my texts for a month. I am not waiting around while you play the grieving son. The real estate market is hot right now, and I want my equity pulled out of that property immediately. Brenda, you cannot do this today, I pleaded, holding the heavy folder with shaking hands. I just buried my father. I do not even have the money to pay the cemetery. If you force a sale right now, the bank will take whatever is left to cover the second mortgage we took out. I will have absolutely nowhere to live. I will be on the street. She let out a short, cruel laugh. That sounds like a personal problem, Elias. You chose to ruin our finances paying for your father to rot slowly in a hospital bed. I warned you. I told you a year ago to put him in a cheap state facility and focus on us. But no, you had to be the hero. You had to drain your own life to extend his miserable one. Now look at you. Look at your clothes. Look at this disgusting car. I stared at the woman I had promised to spend my life with. We had shared a home for 10 years. We had talked about having children. We had built a life together before the medical bills destroyed everything. Now she was looking at me like I was a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of her expensive boot. I cannot sign this right now, I said, pushing the folder back toward the window. Give me a week. Let me figure out how to keep my father from being pulled out of the mud. I just need a little time. Brenda shoved the folder right back into my chest, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into my wetsuit jacket. You do not have a week, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. You are going to sign that consent form right now, and you are going to vacate the premises by tomorrow morning so my real estate agent can stage the property. I have already secured a cash buyer who wants a quick closing. I shook my head, unable to comprehend the sheer malice radiating from her. Why are you doing this today? Why are you doing this to me when I am already at the absolute bottom? Because I am moving on with my life, she said sharply. You are a paramedic saving lives, but you cannot even save your own worthless life, Elias. Sign the papers. I need the money for a plane ticket to Rome next week. I am going with someone who actually has a future, someone who does not smell like hospital bleach and failure. The words struck me with the force of a freight train. Rome. A vacation. She was rendering me homeless on the day of my father's funeral, so she could fund a romantic European getaway with another man. The cruelty was so precise, so calculated, it left me completely paralyzed. I looked down at the signature line on the document. I thought about fighting her in court, but with what money, with what lawyer? I was a paramedic working graveyard shifts, drowning in debt and physically exhausted to the point of collapse. Sign it, she demanded, tapping her pen against the window frame. Or my lawyer will drag you in front of a judge on Monday and they will hold you in contempt. I will make sure they garnish your paramedic wages for the legal fees. I took the pen from her hand. The rain blew through the window, mixing with the tears I refused to let her see. I placed the document on the steering wheel and signed my name. I signed away the small 2-bedroom house we had bought together. I signed away the only place I had left to sleep. I handed the folder back to her. She snatched it quickly, checking the signature to make sure it was legible. Have your trash out of the house by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said, turning her back to me. The locksmith is coming at 9. She walked back to her silver SUV, got inside, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. The red taillights faded into the gray, stormy distance, leaving me in total silence. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, shivering violently. My suit was soaked through to my skin. I had no money. I had no family. I had no wife. And starting tomorrow, I had no home. But the most pressing nightmare was the ticking clock Mr. Garvey had set. I had 48 hours to find $12,500 or my father would be dug up and thrown into a cold storage locker. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the cemetery. I drove past the sprawling suburban neighborhoods, past the country club where my sister was currently sipping champagne, and headed straight into the grim industrial side of the city. I pulled into a decaying strip mall and parked in front of a storefront with neon yellow signs flashing in the window. The sign read Rapid Cash Title and Payday Loans. It was the kind of place that thrived on human desperation. It was a predator waiting for bleeding prey. I walked through the glass doors, the bell jingling cheerfully above my head. The air inside smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. A man with a thick neck and a greasy polo shirt sat behind a thick wall of bulletproof glass. "I need $12,500, I said, walking up to the glass. I pulled my paramedic badge and my driver license out of my wet pocket and slid them into the metal tray. The man barely looked at me. He typed a few keys on his computer. "What do you have for collateral?" he asked in a bored tone. "I have my car," I said. "It is parked outside. It is a Honda sedan paid off." He glanced out the window at my rusted vehicle and snorted. "I will give you $2,000 for that piece of junk. You need 10.5 more. "What else, House?" "No," I said, my chest tightening. "I do not own my house anymore. I just signed it away an hour ago." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Then you are out of luck, buddy. We do not do unsecured loans for that amount unless you want to sign a predatory advance contract. I am talking an extreme interest rate. You miss one payment and we garnish your paychecks until the end of time. We take 70% of everything you earn directly from your employer." "Print it," I said without a single second of hesitation. The man raised an eyebrow. "You do not even want to know the interest rate." "I do not care," I replied, staring blankly at the bulletproof glass. "I just need a cashier's check for a funeral home by tomorrow morning. I will sign whatever you want." For the next hour, I sat in a cheap plastic chair and signed my financial soul over to the devil. The terms of the loan were designed to ensure I would never climb out of poverty. I was guaranteeing that every back-breaking night shift I worked for the next 5 years would go directly into the pockets of the loan company. I was trading my entire future for a wooden box in the mud, but I signed every page, initialed every terrifying clause, and handed the paperwork back. The man passed a certified cashier's check for $12,500 through the slot. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Good luck, man. You are going to need it." I took the check and drove straight back across town to the funeral home. Mr. Garvey was sitting in his plush leather chair, sipping a cup of hot coffee when I walked into his immaculate office. I dripped muddy water onto his expensive Persian rug. I placed the check on his mahogany desk and slid it toward him. He picked it up, examined the watermarks, and smiled a thin, satisfied smile. "Well, look at that, Elias," he said smoothly. "I knew you would figure it out. It is amazing what people can accomplish when they are properly motivated. I will have the grounds crew finish packing the dirt. Your father will rest in peace." I did not say a word. I turned around and walked out of the funeral home. By the time I drove back to my house, the sun had already gone down. The rain had turned into a freezing drizzle. I pulled into the driveway and stared at the dark, empty windows of the place I used to call home. I walked up to the front door and inserted my key. It did not turn. I tried again, jiggling the metal handle. It was completely locked out. Brenda had not waited until tomorrow morning. She had paid an emergency locksmith to come out hours early. A bright orange notice was taped to the wood warning me that unauthorized entry would be considered trespassing. She had successfully locked me out of my own life. I stood on the porch holding my worthless key in the freezing cold. I had a few changes of clothes in my car for my paramedic shifts, but nothing else. Everything I owned was behind that locked door, and I was legally barred from touching it. I got back into my car and drove. I drove aimlessly through the dark streets of Detroit until I saw the familiar glowing signs of the Emergency Medical Services Dispatch Center. I parked in the far back corner of the employee lot near the chain-link fence. Parked against the fence was rig number 4. It was a decommissioned, battered ambulance that the company was planning to sell for scrap metal at the end of the month. The engine did not run. The heating system was completely broken. The tires were flat. But the back doors were unlocked. I grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk of my Honda, walked through the freezing rain, and pulled the heavy rear doors of the ambulance open. It smelled strongly of bleach, old vinyl, and sickness. I climbed inside and pulled the doors shut behind me, plunging myself into total darkness. I walked over to the hard, unpadded patient stretcher bolted to the floor of the ambulance. I threw my bag down, took off my soaked suit jacket, and lay down on the freezing metal surface. I pulled a thin, scratchy emergency blanket out of a supply cabinet and wrapped it tightly around my shivering body. I stared up at the dark ceiling of the battered ambulance. My bank account was empty. My wages were legally doomed. My wife was flying to Rome with another man. My siblings were sleeping in luxury ski lodges, completely unbothered by the fact that our father was buried in the mud and their youngest brother was sleeping on a metal table in a scrapyard. They had stripped me of my dignity, my finances, and my home. They thought I was a pathetic, worthless loser who would just fade away into the shadows of this miserable city. But as I lay there freezing and utterly broken, a strange, terrifying calm settled over me. I had hit the absolute bottom. There was nowhere left to fall, and tomorrow morning, the attorney was going to read my father's will. I woke up freezing on the hard metal stretcher of the decommissioned ambulance. My neck was stiff and my back screamed in pain as I forced myself to sit up. It had been exactly 1 week since I stood in the pouring rain and buried my father alone. It had been exactly 6 days since my wife handed me a court order and locked me out of our home. I had spent the entire week washing my face in gas station sinks, eating stale crackers from hospital vending machines, and working grueling night shifts just to keep my mind off the crushing $12,500 predatory loan hanging over my head. Today was the day Mr. Abernathy, my father's longtime attorney, was reading the will. I pushed open the heavy rear doors of the ambulance and stepped out into the freezing morning air. I looked down at my clothes. I was wearing the only suit I had left. It was wrinkled cheap, and it smelled faintly of the damp vinyl interior of the rig I had been sleeping in. I tried to smooth out the creases with my hands, but it was useless. I looked exactly like what I was, a broken homeless paramedic drowning in debt. I drove my rusted car to the towering glass and steel high-rise downtown. Walking into the immaculate marble-floored lobby of the law firm felt like stepping onto an alien planet. The air smelled of expensive espresso and rich leather. The receptionist at the front desk looked at my wrinkled clothes with thinly veiled disgust before pointing me toward the private conference rooms down the hall. Before I even reached the door, I heard the loud, obnoxious laughter echoing down the corridor. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the plush waiting area outside Mr. Abernathy's office. Bradley and Sarah were already there. They looked like they had just stepped out of a luxury magazine catalog. Bradley was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. His wife, Chloe, was sitting next to him, tapping away on her phone, a massive diamond ring glittering under the chandelier lights. Sarah was perched on a leather sofa wearing a sleek designer dress, sipping sparkling water. Her husband, Richard Kensington, a hedge fund manager with a notoriously ruthless reputation, was casually checking his gold Rolex. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the room fell dead silent. 4 pairs of eyes locked onto me, scanning me from head to toe. "Wow," Bradley said, breaking the silence with a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. "Did you sleep in a dumpster?" "Elias, you smell like wet dog and desperation." Sarah wrinkled her nose and placed her sparkling water on the glass coffee table. "Seriously, Elias, you could have made an effort today. We are in a highly respected law firm. You are going to stain the leather chairs looking like that." "I did not have time to go to the dry cleaners," I said, keeping my voice low. "I just got off a 14-hour shift." "Oh, right," the noble paramedic Bradley sneered. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "I heard Brenda finally dumped the dead weight. She actually texted Chloe yesterday to ask for a recommendation for a divorce lawyer. Honestly, I respect her for it. She finally realized you are a sinking ship. How does it feel getting kicked to the curb by the only person who actually tolerated you?" My chest tightened. The urge to lunge across the room and hit him was overwhelming. He was using the total destruction of my marriage as a casual joke to entertain his wife. "I buried Dad a week ago," I said, staring directly into Bradley's eyes. I stood in the mud by myself. "The funeral director almost took the casket back because you two refused to answer your phones." Sarah let out a heavy sigh and rolled her eyes. "Do not start with the guilt trips, Elias. We were busy. Bradley and Chloe were in Aspen, and Richard and I had a charity gala for the hospital board. You know, the people who actually run the medical system, not the people who drive the taxi cabs to the emergency room." Richard smirked and adjusted his silk tie. "Besides Elias, your father made his bed. He ran that pathetic trucking company into the ground because he refused to listen to my financial advice. I told him to sell Thorn Transit a decade ago. He chose to be stubborn. You chose to sit by his hospital bed and hold his hand instead of building a real career. This is your mess." I looked at Richard, a man who had never once visited my father in the hospital. I remembered the endless nights I spent changing my father's oxygen tanks, calculating his medication dosages, and skipping meals just to afford his copays. While I was doing that, Richard and Sarah were buying a vacation home in the Hamptons. "Did you even care that he died?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Either of you," Bradley stood up, towering over me. His face hardened into a mask of pure arrogance. "We cared about the legacy of this family, Elias. A legacy the old man almost destroyed with his incompetence. But today, we fix that. Today, Abernathy officially hands over the keys to the kingdom, and Sarah and I can finally restructure the assets the right way. We are not here to cry over spilled milk. We are here to collect what is rightfully ours." Before I could respond, the heavy mahogany doors to the inner office swung open. Mr. Abernathy stepped out. He was an older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His face was deeply lined, and he carried a thick leather binder under his arm. "Please come in," Mr. Abernathy said. His voice was somber and formal. The moment we walked into the office and sat around the massive conference table, Bradley and Sarah instantly, completely shifted their demeanors. The arrogant smirks vanished. Sarah reached into her designer purse and pulled out a tissue, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes. Bradley lowered his head and put on a mask of deep manufactured sorrow. "It has been such a difficult week, Mr. Abernathy," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling artificially. "We miss him so much. It is just so hard to be in this room without him." Abernathy looked at her over his glasses. He did not offer a comforting smile. He simply opened the leather folder and cleared his throat. "We are here today to execute the last will and testament of Richard Thorn," Abernathy began, his voice echoing in the large room. Richard was very specific about his wishes. He reviewed this document thoroughly just 1 month before he passed. Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished table. His eyes were wide with barely contained greed. "We understand completely. Dad and I discussed the succession plan extensively before his health declined. We are ready to execute his vision." I stared at Bradley in pure disgust. He had not spoken a single word to our father in 3 years. There had been no discussions. There had been no succession planning. Bradley was just eager to get his hands on the money. "Let us proceed, then," Abernathy said. He flipped to the first page of the heavy document. "To my eldest son, Bradley Thorn, and my daughter, Sarah Thorn Kensington, I leave the entirety of the Thorn family trusts." The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah gasped loudly, dropping her tissue on the table. She immediately grabbed Richard's hand, squeezing it tight. Her eyes were wide with pure ecstasy. Bradley let out a breath he had clearly been holding, a massive victorious smile spreading across his face. He looked at his wife Chloe and gave her a sharp nod. "The family trusts," Richard muttered under his breath, leaning back in his chair with immense satisfaction. "That is the holding entity for the commercial real estate liquidations. That is where all the cash from the 90s went. That is millions, tens of millions." Sarah let out a squeal of delight. "Oh my God, Richard. The villa in Tuscany. We can put the cash offer down on the villa in Tuscany next week." Bradley was already pulling out his phone, probably calculating how quickly he could transfer the funds into his own real estate firm to buy out his local competitors. "I knew he was right. I knew, Dad, thank you," Bradley said loudly to the ceiling, putting on his best performance of a grateful son. "I will not let you down. I will build this empire back up." I sat frozen in my chair. The Thorn family trusts. I had never even heard of them. For years I had watched my father struggle to pay the electricity bill for the trucking company. I had watched him stress over the cost of diesel fuel. If he had millions of dollars sitting in a trust fund, why did he let me drown in medical debt to keep him alive? Why did he let me ruin my credit and destroy my marriage? Mr. Abernathy did not pause to let them celebrate. He turned the page and the room went completely silent again as his eyes shifted directly to me. Abernathy looked at me, and for a fleeting second I saw something in his eyes that looked terrifyingly like pity. He adjusted his glasses and read the next line. To my youngest son, Elias Thorne, I leave 100% ownership of Thorne Transit, all of its associated operating assets, and the full burden of its corporate liabilities. I stared at the lawyer, my brain struggling to process the words. Thorne Transit, the failing trucking company, the company that had not turned a profit in over 5 years. Abernathy reached into the leather folder and pulled out a small, heavy envelope. He slid it across the long mahogany table toward me. I also leave Elias this key, the document states. It belongs to safety deposit box number 481 at the First National Bank downtown. The contents of that box are for his eyes only. I picked up the envelope with shaking hands. I opened the flap and tipped it over. A single chipped brass key fell into my palm. It looked old, worn, and entirely insignificant. For 3 seconds, the room was perfectly quiet. And then Bradley burst into laughter. It was not a chuckle. It was a loud, roaring, breathless laugh that bounced off the walls of the elegant office. He slapped his hand hard against the conference table, his face turning red with amusement. Sarah joined in, covering her mouth as she giggled uncontrollably. Richard Kensington simply shook his head, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Are you kidding me?" Bradley choked out, pointing a finger at me. "You got the trucking company? You actually got Thorne Transit." I looked at the small key in my hand, my heart pounding against my ribs. "What is so funny?" I asked, my voice barely audible over their laughter. "What is so funny?" Bradley wiped a tear of joy from his eye and leaned across the table. "Elias, you absolute idiot. Thorne Transit is a dead shell. Dad took out a massive commercial line of credit against that company right before his heart gave out. It is currently carrying a lien of $400,000 in toxic debt." The blood drained completely from my face. My breath caught in my throat. $400,000 in debt. "Congratulations, buddy." Bradley sneered, his voice dripping with pure malice. "The old man knows you like cleaning up trash, so he left the whole debt to you. You wanted to be the loyal son who stayed by his side. You got exactly what you deserved. He handed us the cash and he handed you an anchor. Work hard to pay it off. Maybe you can pick up a few extra ambulance shifts. It should only take you about 2 lifetimes. Sarah laughed again, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "This is actually poetic," she said smoothly. "You were always the martyr, Elias. Now you get to be the martyr for the bank. I guess all those years changing his bedpans really paid off for you. Have fun explaining a $400,000 commercial debt to your loan sharks." I looked at Mr. Abernathy silently, begging him to tell me this was a mistake. I begged him with my eyes to tell me that my father had not intentionally ruined my life. But Abernathy just closed the leather folder, his face completely unreadable. "That concludes the distribution of the estate," Abernathy said quietly. Bradley, Sarah. My assistants will be in touch tomorrow to begin the transfer of the trust entities into your names. Elias, the deed and the debt obligations for Thorne Transit are now legally yours. Bradley stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a victorious flourish. He walked over to my chair and patted me forcefully on the shoulder. "Hey, do not look so sad," Bradley mocked. "At least he gave you a shiny little key. Maybe there is a coupon for a free sandwich in that bank box. You are going to need it since Brenda took your house." They did not even say goodbye to the lawyer. Bradley, Chloe. Sarah and Richard walked out of the office together, talking loudly about booking first-class tickets to Italy and calling their real estate brokers. Their laughter echoed down the hallway until the heavy doors swung shut, leaving me completely alone in the silent room. I sat staring at the chipped brass key in the palm of my hand. I had lost my wife. I had lost my home. I had taken out a predatory loan just to put my father in the ground, and now the father I had sacrificed everything for had rewarded my loyalty by burying me under $500,000 in toxic corporate debt. My siblings thought they had won everything. They thought they had secured their glamorous futures while handing me a life sentence of financial slavery. I gripped the small brass key so tightly the jagged edges cut into my skin. I did not know it yet, but that key was not an anchor. It was a detonator. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair of the conference room. The mahogany table felt like a block of ice under my hands. The echoing laughter of my older brother and sister still bounced around the walls of my skull, a cruel soundtrack to my absolute ruin. $400,000 in toxic corporate debt. I looked down at the chipped brass key resting in my sweaty palm. It was supposed to be a piece of my father's legacy. Instead, it was a financial tombstone dragging me straight to the bottom of the ocean. I slowly stood up my legs, feeling like they were made of concrete. I walked out of the law firm, passing the front desk, where the receptionist did not even bother to look up from her computer screen. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out onto the freezing streets of downtown Detroit. The wind cut right through my thin, wrinkled suit jacket. I had no home to return to. Brenda had officially changed the locks and put my house on the market. I had slept on a metal stretcher in the back of a junked ambulance the night before. All I wanted to do was get to my vehicle, turn the heat on high, and figure out how I was going to survive the next 24 hours. I walked 3 blocks down the gray, rain-slicked sidewalk toward the cheap municipal parking garage. I was not driving my rusted sedan today. Brenda had demanded that car in the initial divorce filings just to spite me. To get to the lawyer's office, I had been forced to take the old utility truck my father and I used to haul his medical equipment and wheelchair. It was a heavy-duty pickup, reliable but beaten down by years of hard labor. My father had registered it under the Thorn Transit Company name a decade ago for tax purposes. It was the only shelter and transportation I had left in the world. I turned the corner into the dark concrete structure of the parking garage and froze. Flashing yellow strobe lights painted the concrete walls. A massive industrial tow truck was backed up directly to the front bumper of my father's pickup. A man in a heavy canvas jacket was kneeling in the grease and puddles, wrapping thick steel chains around the front axle. The harsh grinding sound of the hydraulic winch echoed loudly through the empty garage. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I broke into a full sprint. "Stop what you are doing right now. That is my truck." The tow truck driver did not even flinch. He stood up, wiped his greasy hands on his jeans, and looked at me with the bored, empty expression of a man who dealt with screaming people every single day. "You Elias Thorn?" the driver asked, pulling a clipboard out of his jacket pocket. "Yes, that is my name. That is my truck. You cannot just take it. I parked legally. My ticket is fully paid on the dashboard." The driver shook his head and clicked his pen. "I am not here for a parking violation, buddy. This is a bank-ordered asset recovery. Thorn Transit has completely defaulted on its commercial lines of credit. The moment the primary account holder was registered as deceased, the bank called the loans. Every single asset tied to the corporate entity is being seized immediately to satisfy the outstanding debt." I felt the blood drain completely from my face. My chest tightened so violently I could barely draw a breath. "Wait," I pleaded, stepping closer to the massive metal chains. "You do not understand. I just inherited this company 30 minutes ago. I did not even know the debt existed until I walked into a lawyer's office. You have to give me time to call the bank. You have to give me a chance to restructure this. All of my paramedic gear is in that back seat. My clothes are in there." The driver handed me a piece of paper printed with bright red ink. "I do not care if you inherited it 30 minutes ago or 30 years ago. I have a court-stamped recovery order from First National Bank. If you want to argue, call the number on the paper. But step away from the rig or I am calling the police to report a hostile interference." I grabbed the paper with shaking hands. I pulled out my phone and dialed the toll-free number printed at the bottom of the page. A relentless automated menu kept me waiting in the freezing wind for 5 agonizing minutes before a cold, professional voice finally answered the line. First National Commercial Recovery. This is Agent Miller. How can I assist you? My name is Elias Thorne, I said, my voice rising in a desperate panic. Your driver is hooking up my truck in a parking garage right now. You are making a huge mistake. The company just transferred ownership to me. I need a grace period. I need 30 days to figure out a payment plan. You cannot take my only vehicle. Mr. Thorne, I am looking at the file right now, the agent said, typing loudly on her keyboard. Thorne Transit is carrying a liability of exactly $412,000. The loan covenants explicitly state that upon the death of Richard Thorne, all corporate assets act as immediate collateral. The bank is exercising its legal right to reclaim its property. We do not offer grace periods on $500,000 of toxic debt. Please, I begged, the humiliation burning in my throat. I am a paramedic. I work 14-hour night shifts. I have no home. If you take this truck, I have absolutely no way to get to the hospital to work. If I cannot work, I cannot pay you a single dime. Just let me keep the truck to get to my job. The agent let out a tired sigh. Mr. Thorne, your personal employment status is not relevant to this commercial collection. You have inherited a massive corporate liability. I highly suggest you retain bankruptcy counsel immediately. Have a good day. The line clicked dead. I stared at the phone in pure disbelief. I looked up just as the hydraulic winch screamed loudly, lifting the front tires of my truck off the concrete. The driver climbed into the cab of his tow truck and put it in gear. "Wait!" I yelled, running toward the passenger door of my truck. "Let me get my bag. Just let me get my uniform and my clothes." The driver rolled down his window and shook his head. "The vehicle is sealed as bank property now. If you want to claim personal items left inside a commercial asset, you have to file a formal request at the impound lot on Monday morning between 9 and 11. Step back." I stood completely helpless in the freezing puddle as the tow truck roared to life and pulled my last remaining lifeline out of the parking garage. The red taillights disappeared down the ramp, leaving me standing in the dark, shivering in a thin suit with absolutely nothing. I had just been handed a $400,000 death sentence, and the bank had not even given me an hour to process it before they started stripping the meat from my bones. I walked out of the parking garage and sat down on a wet wooden bus bench on the street corner. The cold wind slapped my face. I buried my face in my hands, trying to suppress the overwhelming urge to completely break down. I was 36 years old. I saved human lives for a living. I pulled people out of crushed cars and restarted their hearts. But nobody was coming to restart mine. I was completely invisible to the world. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, praying it was a mistake, praying the bank had realized the truck was not worth the legal hassle, and they were bringing it back. I looked at the caller ID. It was Director Harrison, the head of operations at the emergency medical center where I worked. I cleared my throat, trying to sound professional. "Hello, Director Harrison. I am scheduled for the night shift tonight. I might be a little late. My car was just towed," Elias Harrison said. His voice was heavy, formal, and uncomfortable. "You are not coming in for the night shift. You are not coming in at all." A fresh wave of terror washed over me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my grip on the phone tightening. "Did I do something wrong on my last rotation? My patient reports are fully updated." "You did nothing wrong in the field, Elias. You are a phenomenal paramedic. But Human Resources just flagged your file this morning," Harrison explained, his tone completely detached. "A major donor to the hospital board contacted our legal department an hour ago. They provided documentation proving that you are now the sole owner of a severely distressed corporate entity carrying nearly $500,000 in toxic debt." My heart completely stopped. How does the hospital even know about that? I literally just left the lawyer's office. The ink on the will is not even dry yet. Harrison sighed into the phone. The donor provided a certified copy of the estate transfer. "Elias, You understand the strict morality and background check clauses in your employment contract. Paramedics have direct, unsupervised access to heavily controlled narcotics and highly sensitive patient financial data. Hospital policy dictates that any employee who assumes a catastrophic, unmanageable level of high-risk debt is an immediate liability. We cannot employ someone who is deemed a severe flight risk or susceptible to bribery and theft. I am not a thief, I shouted, jumping to my feet on the sidewalk. I have saved hundreds of lives for this hospital. I have worked 100 hours a week covering shifts nobody else wanted. You know me, Harrison. I would never touch the narcotics. I would never compromise a patient. You cannot fire me over my father's business debt. My hands are tied, Elias Harrison said quietly. The board considers you an extreme liability. They do not want the legal exposure. Your termination is effective immediately. We will mail your final paycheck to the address on file. I do not have an address anymore. I whispered, my voice breaking completely. Harrison, please. If you fire me, I am going to end up on the street. I have nothing. You are the only lifeline I have left. I am sorry, Elias. I really am. I wish you the best of luck. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. I could not breathe. It felt like the entire city of Detroit was crushing my chest. I had lost my wife, my home, my car, and my career in the span of exactly 7 days. I was standing on a street corner with $500,000 in debt and absolutely no way to ever earn a paycheck in my field again. The speed of the destruction was unnatural. It was too fast. It was too perfect. My phone rang again instantly. I stared at the screen. The caller ID displayed a name that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. It was Richard Kensington, my sister's husband, the ruthless hedge fund manager. I pressed answer and held the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. Elias Richard said, his voice smooth, calm, and dripping with absolute victory. I assume you just had a very disappointing conversation with Director Harrison. It was you, I hissed, my voice trembling with a rage so deep it physically hurt my throat. You are the major hospital donor. You called human resources. You got me fired. Guilty as charged. Richard chuckled softly. Do not take it personally, Elias. It is just business. You see, when Abernathy read the will today, I noticed a very problematic legal loophole. If you officially accept the Thorn Transit inheritance, and the bank begins aggressive litigation against you for that massive debt, their lawyers might try to poke around the entire estate. They might try to trigger an audit to see if Thorn Transit had any cross-collateralization with the family trusts that Sarah and Bradley just inherited. I closed my eyes, the sheer evil of his plan suddenly making perfect sense. I cannot have auditors sniffing around my wife's new millions just because you decided to play the tragic hero. Richard continued coldly. So I am making sure you do the smart thing. You are going to formally renounce the inheritance. You are going to file an estate rejection on Monday morning. You will let Thorn Transit completely dissolve into bankruptcy, totally isolated from the rest of the family money. You ruined my life to protect a loophole. I said, my voice hollow. You took my job. You took my ability to survive. I showed you reality, Elias. Richard snapped, his tone turning vicious. You are a nobody. You are a blue-collar worker who thought he was morally superior to us because you changed bedpans. Now you have no job, no car, no wife, and no house. You have absolutely no leverage. You are going to march into Abernathy's office on Monday, and you are going to sign a legal renunciation of the Thorn Transit estate. You will take the fall, and the bank will write off the debt as uncollectible. And if I refuse, I asked. Richard laughed. If you refuse, you spend the rest of your miserable life paying off $500,000 while making minimum wage flipping burgers. Sign the renunciation, Elias. Do as you are told. If you behave and sign the papers, maybe I will toss you $1,000 out of my own pocket so you can buy a bus ticket out of state and start over. Have a terrible weekend. He hung up. I stood in the freezing rain, the noise of the city traffic rushing past me. Richard and Sarah thought they had completely broken me. They had orchestrated my total destruction just to protect their unearned wealth. They had stripped me down to the bone, expecting me to crawl into the law office on Monday and surrender. I reached into my wet pocket. My fingers wrapped around the small, chipped brass key Mr. Abernathy had given me. It was the key to safety deposit box number 481. My father had left it for my eyes only. Richard thought I had no leverage. He thought he had trapped me in a corner. But my father was a man who built an empire from nothing, and he never made a move without a reason. He had left me the debt, but he had also left me this key. I wiped the rain from my face. I did not have a car. I did not have a job. But I was not going to surrender. I gripped the brass key tightly in my fist, turned my collar up against the freezing wind, and started walking toward the First National Bank downtown. I stepped away from the freezing street corner and began the long walk toward the downtown branch of the First National Bank. The freezing Detroit wind hit my face like a physical blow. I did not have a car to turn the heater on. I did not have a home to retreat to. I was a 36-year-old man standing on the pavement in a ruined suit with a chipped brass key burning a hole in my pocket. The sky above was a heavy, brutal gray, and it had started to snow. Huge wet flakes mixed with the freezing rain stinging my skin and soaking my clothes all over again. I had to walk 3 miles. Every step I took felt like I was dragging 100 pounds of lead chained to my ankles. My boots were completely soaked. My toes went numb after the first mile. The city traffic roared past me, spraying dirty slush onto the sidewalks, but I did not stop. I could not stop. Richard Kensington thought he had broken me. My brother Bradley thought he had saddled me with a financial death sentence. My wife Brenda thought I was a pathetic loser who could not even afford a roof over his head. They all believed that the $400,000 debt attached to Thorn Transit would force me to surrender. They wanted me to march back into the lawyer office on Monday morning and sign away the company so their precious millions would remain untouched. But my father was not a cruel man. He was strict. He was stubborn. He was demanding. But he was never cruel. I kept replaying the memory of him sitting in his wheelchair, struggling to breathe while he looked at his trucking company ledgers. He always told me that people who only look at the surface of things will always miss the foundation. I held on to that thought as I pushed through the biting snow. The brass key in my pocket felt heavy. It was the only thing anchoring me to the earth. I reached the massive granite steps of the First National Bank at exactly 4:45 in the afternoon. They closed at 5. I pulled open the heavy glass doors and stumbled into the warm marble lobby. I looked like a vagrant. My suit was plastered to my body and my hair was matted to my forehead. My shoes squeaked loudly against the pristine floor. A security guard immediately put his hand on his radio, taking a step toward me. I kept my head down and walked straight to the customer service desk. The woman sitting behind the polished mahogany counter looked up from her computer monitor. She wore a tailored blazer and a name tag that read Patricia. Her eyes scanned my ruined clothes, my muddy shoes, and my exhausted face. Her upper lip curled in a barely concealed sneer of disgust. "Sir, the public restrooms are located down the street at the bus terminal," she said. Her voice was dripping with condescension. "This is a private financial institution. We are closing in 10 minutes and I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security to escort you out." I took a deep breath and placed my hands on the edge of her desk. "I am not here for the restroom," I said. My voice was raspy from the cold. "I am here to access a safety deposit box. My name is Elias Thorne. I need to get into the vault." Patricia let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. She looked around to see if any of her co-workers were watching. "Right," she said, crossing her arms. "You have a safety deposit box here. Sir, the annual maintenance fee for our vault boxes is more than your entire outfit is worth. Please do not make me call the guard." I reached into my wet pocket and pulled out the chipped brass key. I slammed it down onto the polished wood of her desk. The metal clinked sharply. I pulled out my damp driver license and the certified legal document the attorney had given me releasing the box to my name. I slid them across the desk right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. "I am the executor of Box 481, I said, keeping my voice deadly calm. "You close at 5. It is 4:48. Take me to the vault right now." Patricia stared at the documents. Her face turned bright red as she read the raised seal from the attorney. She snatched the key and the paperwork, clicking her tongue in extreme annoyance. "Fine," she muttered, standing up abruptly. "But you have exactly 5 minutes. We are locking the doors at 5 sharp, and I am not staying late on a Friday just because you decided to drag mud into my lobby. Follow me and do not touch anything else." I followed her down a long, silent hallway lined with security cameras. We entered an elevator that took us down into the basement level. The air down there was cold and smelled of ozone and ancient metal. We stepped into the massive steel vault. The walls were lined with thousands of small rectangular metal doors. Patricia walked down the third aisle, scanning the numbers. She stopped in front of box 481. She inserted her master key into the first lock and turned it. Then she gestured for me to hand her my chipped brass key. I gave it to her. She pushed it into the second lock and turned it with a loud clank. She pulled the long metal drawer out of the wall and carried it over to a private viewing table in the corner of the room. "You have 4 minutes, she said, looking at her watch. "Do whatever you need to do and bring the box right back here." She walked out of the room, closing the heavy door behind her, leaving me alone in the dead silence of the vault. My hands were shaking. I stood in front of the metal box, staring at the dull gray lid. This was it. This was the secret my father had hidden from Bradley, from Sarah, from Richard Kensington, and from the rest of the world. This was the reason he had loaded me with $400,000 of debt. It had to be something incredible. It had to be bearer bonds. It had to be a stack of cashier checks. It had to be a safety net that would instantly wipe out the predatory funeral loan I had just taken and buy back the house my wife had stolen from me. I placed my hands on the cold metal lid. I closed my eyes, taking one long, ragged breath, and I flipped it open. I stared down into the box. My heart stopped beating entirely. My stomach dropped straight through the concrete floor. The box was virtually empty. There were no stacks of $100 bills. There were no gold coins. There were no hidden diamonds or offshore bank account passwords. Lying at the bottom of the long metal tray was nothing but an incredibly old, heavily yellowed accounting ledger bound in cracked black leather. Beneath the ledger was a thick stack of dusty legal papers bound together with a brittle rubber band. The paper smelled like mildew and decades of decay. That was it. That was the grand inheritance. That was the secret weapon my father had left me to fight off a $500,000 corporate liability. I reached into the box and pulled out the ledger. The leather flaked off onto my fingers. I picked up the stack of legal papers. The rubber band snapped, instantly crumbling into dry pieces. I felt a wave of absolute despair wash over me. It was so heavy it brought tears to my eyes. My brother was right. Bradley was completely right. My father was just a stubborn old man who had driven his company into the ground and lost his mind at the end. He had not left me a lifeline. He had left me a box of literal garbage. He had left me his old trucking manifests and meaningless files from 30 years ago. He really had rewarded my decade of loyalty by throwing me to the wolves. For one terrifying second, I wanted to throw the ledger against the wall. I wanted to tear the dusty legal papers into pieces and leave them on the floor for Patricia to clean up. I wanted to walk out of that bank march straight to the bridge and jump into the freezing river because there was simply no way out of this nightmare. But as I stood there gripping the yellowed pages, I remembered a conversation I had with my father when I was 12 years old. We were sitting in the garage behind the Thorn Transit dispatch office. He was rebuilding a destroyed diesel engine piece by piece. His hands were covered in black grease. I had asked him why he was wasting his time on a broken engine when he could just buy a new one. He looked at me, wiped his forehead with a dirty rag, and pointed at the engine block. "Elias," he said, his voice rough but kind. Most people look at a pile of broken parts and see trash. They throw it away because it takes too much patience to find the pieces that still have value. Never throw something away until you understand exactly how it works. The people who win in this life are the ones who are willing to read the fine print while everyone else is busy looking for a shortcut. I looked down at the old black ledger in my hand. Bradley would have tossed this in the trash without a second thought. Sarah would have laughed at it and ordered a maid to throw it out. Richard Kensington would have shredded it without even opening the cover. But I was not them. I carefully placed the ledger and the legal documents inside my suit jacket, pressing them flat against my chest to keep them dry. I closed the metal box, slid it back into the wall, and walked out of the vault. I left the bank and walked back out into the brutal Detroit winter. The snow was falling harder now, covering the city in a blanket of freezing white. I had nowhere to go. My ambulance had been towed. My car was in an impound lot. My house was locked. I reached into my pocket and counted exactly $43 in crumpled bills. It was the last of my cash. I walked for 2 miles until I found the most run-down, dilapidated boarding house in the industrial district. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, advertising nightly rates. The brick building looked like it was slowly collapsing into the street. I walked into the lobby smelling the overpowering scent of stale beer and wet carpet. I handed a grumpy man behind bulletproof glass $35. He slid a rusty room key back under the slot without saying a word. I walked up 3 flights of stairs that groaned under my weight. The hallway light bulbs buzzed loudly, flickering every few seconds. I unlocked the door to room 32 and pushed it open. The room was tiny and freezing. The radiator in the corner was completely dead. The wallpaper was peeling off in long yellow strips, revealing the rotting drywall underneath. There was a single twin bed with a stained mattress and a small rickety wooden desk pushed against the window. The wind howled, rattling the thin glass panes. This was my new reality. This was where the son of Richard Thorne had ended up. I took off my soaking wetsuit jacket and draped it over the wooden chair. I pulled the black leather ledger and the stack of dusty legal documents out of the inside pocket. They were slightly damp from my body heat, but still intact. The room was too dark to read anything. The single overhead bulb had burned out long ago. I reached into my duffel bag, which I had managed to grab before the tow truck took my vehicle, and pulled out my heavy-duty paramedic flashlight. It was the only piece of professional equipment I still owned. I clicked it on, casting a bright white beam of light across the small wooden desk. I pulled the chair out, sat down in the freezing cold room, and opened the black leather ledger. I wrapped myself in my thin, damp, button-down shirt, shivering as the temperature in the room plummeted below freezing. But I did not care about the cold. I focused the flashlight beam directly onto the first page of the old book. The handwriting was unmistakably my father. It was sharp, precise, and angular. The dates at the top of the pages went back more than 30 years. Back to the time when Thorne Transit was not a failing local trucking company, but a massive, highly profitable logistical operation. I flipped past the first 20 pages, looking at columns of revenue fuel costs and payroll expenses. It looked like standard accounting. For an hour I sat there, my heart sinking a little further with every page. It just looked like the financial ghost of a dead company. But then I reached the middle of the ledger. The handwriting changed. The columns changed. The ink was a different color. My father had stopped recording freight logs and started recording asset transfers. I leaned closer to the desk, squinting in the harsh flashlight beam. I turned to the stack of legal documents and carefully slid the brittle rubber band off. I opened the first folded deed. I read the legal description at the top of the page. It was a land survey document. I matched the parcel numbers on the deed to the handwritten notes in the ledger. My breath hitched in my throat. My hands stopped shaking from the cold and started shaking from pure adrenaline. I flipped to the next page. I read the corporate filings. I read the articles of incorporation for a company I had never heard of before. I read promissory notes that had been stamped, notarized, and legally bound decades ago. I sat in that freezing, dilapidated boarding house reading page after page, document after document for 8 straight hours. I did not sleep. I did not eat. I did not move from the wooden chair. The flashlight beam slowly began to dim as the batteries drained, but I kept reading. I cross-referenced every single date, every single signature, and every single corporate seal. As the sun slowly began to rise over the gray skyline of Detroit, casting a pale, freezing light through the rattling window of my cheap room, the entire picture finally came together. The puzzle my father had left me was fully assembled. I lowered the flashlight and stared at the final page of the ledger. A slow, disbelieving laugh escaped my lips. It echoed loudly in the quiet, peeling room. My father had not lost his mind. My father was a financial genius. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly who Bradley and Sarah really were. He knew they were vultures waiting for him to die so they could strip his bones and sell his legacy to the highest bidder. He knew Richard Kensington was a greedy, arrogant predator who thought he was smarter than a blue-collar trucking boss. So my father had laid a trap. A brilliant, legally binding, completely inescapable trap. And he had used his own funeral, his own will, and his own fake corporate debt as the bait. They had all taken the bait. Bradley, Sarah, Richard, and even my ex-wife Brenda had all played their parts perfectly. They had humiliated me. They had ruined my career. They had stripped me of my home and left me to die in the cold. They thought they had secured their millions and left me with a pile of worthless trash. But as I sat there gripping the yellowed ledger, I realized the absolute truth. I held the keys to their destruction right in my hands. The game was not over. The game had just begun. I sat in the freezing room of the boarding house, my breath forming pale clouds in the harsh white beam of my paramedic flashlight. The cold was seeping through my damp shirt, but I could no longer feel it. My entire body was running on pure adrenaline. I stared at the cracked black leather ledger resting on the rickety wooden desk. The yellowed pages were filled with my father's sharp, precise handwriting. I had spent the last few hours trying to make sense of the columns of numbers, expecting to find the tragic financial diary of a failing trucking company. Instead, I had just stumbled into the most brilliant financial web I had ever seen. At first, the numbers showed exactly what Bradley had laughed about in the lawyer's office. Thorn Transit was bleeding money. Every year for the past decade, the operating losses were massive. The company was drowning in red ink. But as I traced the dates and cross-referenced the expense columns with the stack of dusty legal documents, I noticed a repeating pattern. The money was not being lost to bad business deals or failing engines. The money was being strategically diverted. My father had been intentionally reporting massive losses on the Thorn Transit books to completely zero out his tax liabilities. The trucking company was not his primary business. It was a massive, heavy-duty financial shield. I flipped to the center of the ledger, my hands trembling. The ink color changed from blue to black. The headers on the pages shifted from Thorn Transit to a completely different corporate entity, Oakstone Financial Holdings. I grabbed the stack of brittle legal papers and slid the broken pieces of the rubber band off the top. I unfolded a thick, heavily stamped certificate of incorporation from the state of Delaware. The company was fully registered and active. The sole proprietor holding 100% of the voting shares was Richard Thorn, my father. I read the succession clause at the bottom of the Delaware document. Upon the death of the founder, total ownership of Oakstone Financial Holdings transferred instantly and irrevocably to the legal heir holding the physical master ledger and the corresponding bearer shares. I reached into the back pocket of the ledger and pulled out a heavy, watermarked paper certificate. It was the bearer share document. I was holding it in my hands. I was the sole owner of Oakstone Financial Holdings. But what did Oakstone actually own? I turned the pages of the ledger, scanning the asset columns. My father had taken the massive profits Thorn Transit generated during the economic boom of the 1990s and quietly funneled every single penny into Oakstone. He did not buy luxury cars, designer suits, or vacation homes in Aspen like my brother. He lived in a modest house and wore steel-toed boots while he quietly bought up high-yield assets across the country. I tallied the columns in my head, carrying the numbers over page by page. The total liquid and physical asset value of Oakstone Financial Holdings was not a few $100,000. It was absolutely staggering. I was looking at a hidden empire worth more than $50 million. My chest heaved as I stared at the final number. $50 million. I had just borrowed money from a predatory loan shark at a 300% interest rate to pay a $12,000 funeral bill. I had slept on a metal table in a scrapped ambulance. And all along I was the sole heir to a $50 million fortune. But the sheer size of the wealth was not the most shocking part of the ledger. The true genius of my father's plan was hidden in exactly how he had invested that money. He had not just bought random stocks or mutual funds. He had bought leverage. Specifically, he had bought leverage over the exact people who had just tried to destroy my life. I found a thick manila envelope tucked between the pages near the back of the book. It had Bradley's name written on the front. I opened it and pulled out a commercial real estate contract. It was a 99-year ground lease agreement. I read the property address printed at the top of the first page and my heart slammed against my ribs. It was the exact address of the Oak Creek shopping mall. Oak Creek was Bradley's crown jewel. It was a multi-billion-dollar commercial development project that he had paraded around the financial media for the last 3 years. He had built luxury retail spaces, massive high-end condominiums, and premium restaurants on that sprawling plot of land. It was the foundation of his entire real estate empire. But as I read the fine print of the ground lease, I realized the absolute truth. Bradley did not own the land. He only owned the concrete and glass built on top of it. The actual dirt underneath the massive development belonged exclusively to Oakstone Financial Holdings. My father had leased the land to Bradley's development firm, likely hiding behind layers of corporate lawyers, so Bradley never knew his own father was the landlord. I read the default clauses of the contract. The lease required a balloon payment of $5 million to be paid directly to the holding company upon the death of the primary title holder. If the payment was not made within 7 days of the death, the entire lease automatically defaulted. I checked the dates. My father had passed away 8 days ago. Bradley had completely missed the payment. He probably thought the land was quietly rolled into the family trusts he had just inherited. He had no idea Oakstone even existed. I read the penalty clause for a lease default. It was completely ruthless. Upon default, the landowner had the immediate legal right to seize all improvements built on the property without compensation. That meant the buildings, the luxury mall, the high-end condos. Everything Bradley had spent his life building now legally belonged to the owner of the dirt. It belonged to me. With one single phone call to a real estate attorney, I could foreclose on my arrogant brother's entire empire and evict his company from the premises. He had laughed at me for inheriting a broken trucking company, completely unaware that I held the detonator to his entire professional life. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I set Bradley's folder aside. I reached back into the ledger and pulled out a second envelope. This one had the name Richard Kensington written on the front. My sister Sarah's husband. The ruthless hedge fund manager who had called the hospital board and gotten me fired just to protect his own wealth from a legal audit. I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of heavily redacted promissory notes and corporate bond receipts. Richard ran a notoriously aggressive investment fund. He was famous in the financial world for using extreme amounts of leveraged debt to buy out struggling technology companies, gutting them for parts and selling them off. But hedge funds that operate on that level of risk require massive lines of credit. I traced the paper trail my father had meticulously documented in the ledger. 5 years ago, Richard's fund had taken a catastrophic hit in the market. To keep his fund afloat and hide the massive losses from his wealthy investors, Richard had quietly borrowed $30 million in high-risk mezzanine debt. He had packaged that debt and sold it as high-yield bonds to a private equity firm in Chicago, hoping to buy himself enough time to recover the losses before the debt matured. I looked at the wire transfer receipts stapled to the back of the bond documents. The private equity firm in Chicago had immediately sold that debt to a silent buyer, Oakstone Financial Holdings. My father had used his secret wealth to quietly buy up every single cent of Richard Kensington's toxic debt. My father was Richard's ultimate creditor. I read the specific legal clauses attached to the mezzanine debt notes. Because the debt was classified as high risk, it carried a strict immediate call provision. The primary debt holder could demand immediate repayment of the full $30 million at any time if the original borrower experienced a change in executive management or if the primary debt holder decided to execute the call. I held the corporate bonds in my hands, the rough paper feeling like a loaded weapon. Richard thought he had destroyed my life. He thought he had forced me into a corner where my only option was to renounce my inheritance and walk away with nothing. He had literally laughed at me on the phone, offering me $1,000 to buy a bus ticket out of state. He had absolutely no idea that the broken, unemployed, homeless paramedic he had just mocked was currently holding his entire financial existence in a damp cardboard folder. If I officially executed the call provision on those bonds, Richard's hedge fund would instantly collapse. He did not have $30 million in liquid cash to pay me back. He would be forced to declare bankruptcy. The Securities and Exchange Commission would immediately launch a federal investigation into his fund for hiding his insolvency from his investors. He would face federal prison for financial fraud. Sarah would lose her mansion, her country club memberships, her designer wardrobes, and her entire identity overnight. The people who had refused to lend me $12,000 to bury our father were about to lose everything they had ever touched. I sat back in the wooden chair, my mind reeling from the sheer scale of what I was reading. The cold wind rattled the thin glass window of my cheap boarding house room, but I felt completely numb to it. I looked around the decaying walls, the peeling wallpaper, and the flickering streetlights outside. Then I thought about the luxury conference room at Mr. Abernathy's law office. I thought about the way Bradley and Sarah had swaggered into the room wearing clothes that cost more than my annual salary. They had spent their entire adult lives treating my father like an endless ATM machine and treating me like an embarrassing servant. When my father got sick, they vanished. They left me to handle the terrifying hospital emergency room visits, the late-night medication schedules, and the crushing, suffocating medical bills. They thought my father was blind to their greed. They thought he was just a stubborn, failing old man who did not understand how modern finance worked. They thought they had outsmarted him, but Richard Thorne had seen right through them. He had seen every ounce of their entitlement, their cruelty, and their complete lack of basic human decency. He had watched them circle his hospital bed like vultures waiting for his heart monitor to flatline so they could feast on his legacy. So my father had built a trap. He had designed a brilliant, legally flawless trap specifically tailored to their exact brand of greed. He had created the Thorne Family Trusts. He had established the impressive-sounding legal entities that Bradley and Sarah had cheered for in the lawyer's office. But he had deliberately drained them. The trusts were completely empty shells. They were massive glittering decoys designed to keep my siblings distracted, while the real wealth was quietly secured and buried inside Oakstone Financial Holdings. He had given them a cardboard crown to fight over, and he had handed me the actual kingdom. I flipped back to the very first page of the ledger, looking at the $400,000 debt attached to Thorne Transit. The debt that had cost me my truck and my job. The debt my siblings had laughed at. I traced the routing number of the bank that held the commercial lien. I cross-referenced it with Oakstone's asset sheets. A fierce, involuntary smile broke across my face. The bank did not own the debt. Oakstone Financial Holdings owned the debt. My father had essentially borrowed money from himself. The toxic liability attached to the trucking company was completely fake. It was a closed loop. My father had loaded Thorne Transit with an artificial debt, ensuring that the commercial bank would temporarily seize my assets and push me to the absolute breaking point. He knew my siblings would use that massive debt to mock me. He knew they would use it to try to crush me. He needed me to hit rock bottom. He needed me to lose my false sense of security, my ungrateful wife, and my terrible job, so I would finally wake up and realize exactly who the people around me really were. He needed me to learn that I could not save people who were actively determined to destroy me. My father had stripped me down to nothing just so he could hand me the entire world. He had given me a broken trucking company and a chipped brass key because he knew I was the only person in the family with the patience to open the box, read the ledger, and uncover the truth. He knew I would not throw it away. I closed the heavy black leather ledger and placed my hands flat on top of the cover. The sun was fully rising now, cutting through the gray Detroit storm clouds and casting a bright beam of light across the small wooden desk. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer the tragic martyr changing bedpans while the elite of the family laughed from their ski resorts. I was the sole owner of a $50 million empire, the landlord of my brother's commercial kingdom, and the ultimate creditor holding the leash to my brother-in-law's hedge fund. I carefully packed the ledger and the legal documents back into my duffel bag. I zipped it shut, stood up, and looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror hanging on the boarding house wall. The man staring back at me was exhausted, pale, and wearing a ruined suit. But his eyes were completely different. The fear was gone. The panic was gone. The desperation that had choked me for the last 7 days had completely evaporated. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the freezing room. Bradley, Sarah, Richard, and Brenda had all pushed me to the absolute edge of a cliff, expecting me to fall quietly into the dark. They had demanded that I march into the law firm on Monday morning and surrender everything. I was going to march into that law firm on Monday morning. But I was not going to surrender. I was going to burn their entire fake world straight to the ground. I sat on the edge of the stained twin mattress in my freezing boarding house room, waiting for the sun to rise. It was Monday morning. Outside the rattling window, the streets of Detroit were coming alive with the sound of garbage trucks and morning traffic. I had not slept a single minute over the weekend. I had spent the last 48 hours memorizing every single page of my father's black leather ledger and reviewing every clause in the stack of legal documents I had pulled from the bank vault. I knew exactly what my father had built, and I knew exactly how his trap was designed to snap shut. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the doors of the First National Bank downtown would unlock for normal business hours. That was the exact moment Bradley and Sarah had scheduled their appointments with the senior wealth managers. They were planning to officially transfer the assets from the Thorne family trusts directly into their own personal accounts. They thought they were walking into a bank vault to collect tens of millions of dollars in liquid cash. They had spent the entire weekend celebrating their victory. Bradley had probably already committed capital to his new commercial real estate developments, and Sarah had definitely already put a down payment on that luxury villa in Tuscany she was bragging about. I looked at my cheap plastic wristwatch. It was 8:55. I sat perfectly still, listening to the ticking of the second hand. I knew exactly what was about to happen in that pristine marble lobby. When the senior wealth manager typed my siblings' names into the banking terminal, they were not going to see a massive fortune. They were going to see a bright red flashing screen. My father had utilized a brilliant, perfectly legal financial mechanism known as cross-collateralization. When he established the Thorne family trusts, he deliberately tied them to the corporate liability of Thorne Transit. He legally bound the glittering fake trusts to the massive toxic debt of his failing trucking company. When my father passed away, the bank automatically called the loan on Thorne Transit. But because Bradley and Sarah were now the legal beneficiaries of the trusts, those trusts instantly became liable for the trucking company default. The trap was absolutely flawless. The moment Bradley and Sarah walked into that bank and officially attached their personal financial portfolios to the Thorne family trusts, the banking algorithm would execute an automatic freeze. Every single dollar Bradley had in his real estate development firm would be locked. Every single credit line Sarah and Richard Kensington relied upon to keep their highly leveraged hedge fund afloat would be instantly paralyzed. The bank would seize total control of all their assets, pending a massive federal audit of the estate. My watch hit 9 o'clock. I took a deep breath. The freezing air of the boarding house filled my lungs. I waited. At 9:14, my cell phone began to vibrate violently on the rickety wooden desk. I looked at the screen. It was Bradley. I did not answer. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. This time it was Sarah. I let it ring. Then Richard Kensington called. The phone danced across the scratched wood, buzzing relentlessly for 20 straight minutes. I could picture the scene with perfect clarity. I could see Bradley standing in his custom-tailored suit screaming at a terrified bank teller as his premium black cards were suddenly declined. I could see Sarah panicking in the lobby, her face turning pale as the bank manager pulled them into a private glass office to explain that the federal government had just locked down every penny they owned. They were experiencing the exact same suffocating, helpless terror they had forced upon me when they left me alone at the cemetery. I picked up my phone and listened to the voicemails. "Elias, pick up the phone right now," Bradley shouted, his voice echoing with absolute panic and completely lacking his usual arrogant swagger. "Something is wrong with the trust accounts. The bank just froze my entire corporate portfolio. They are saying it is tied to that garbage trucking company Dad gave you. Call me back right now. You need to come down here and sign a liability release." The next message was from Richard. He was not laughing anymore. His voice was a tight, venomous hiss. "Listen to me very carefully, Elias. My hedge fund payroll accounts were just suspended because of a collateral hold. I have millions of dollars in trades that are going to bounce in 2 hours if you do not clear this up. You need to formally renounce Thorn Transit immediately so we can sever the liability. I am tracking your phone location right now. Do not move." I placed the phone face down on the desk. They had tracked my phone. I knew they would not wait for me to come to them. They were bleeding out and they needed a tourniquet. They needed me to surrender my inheritance so the bank would drop the cross-collateralization and unfreeze their money. They thought I was just a clueless paramedic hiding in a cheap motel. They had no idea I was sitting on top of Oakstone Financial Holdings, holding the legal right to their entire existence. At exactly noon, I heard the heavy, aggressive sound of footsteps pounding up the rotting wooden stairs of the boarding house. The floorboards out in the hallway creaked loudly. The voices were sharp and demanding. I folded my father's black ledger, placed it carefully inside my duffel bag, and zipped it shut. I stood up and smoothed out my wrinkled shirt. The handle of my door was violently twisted. When it did not open, someone kicked the cheap wood right below the deadbolt. The door frame splintered instantly, and the door slammed open, hitting the interior wall with a loud crash. Bradley stormed into the tiny freezing room. He looked absolutely deranged. His expensive silk tie was pulled loose, his hair was a mess, and his face was flushed bright red. Sarah pushed her way in right behind him, gripping her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Richard Kensington followed closely behind them, accompanied by 2 imposing men wearing sharp navy blue suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. They were high-powered corporate litigators. They looked completely out of place, standing in a room with peeling yellow wallpaper and a dead radiator. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "Elias," Bradley screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "I have been calling you for 3 hours. My entire company is completely paralyzed. My contractors are walking off the job site at the Oak Creek Mall because my accounts are frozen. You are ruining my business." I stood my ground, looking at him with a perfectly calm expression. "I did not do anything to your accounts, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice steady and low. "I have been sitting in this room all morning." Richard stepped forward, pushing Bradley aside. He glared at me with pure hatred. "You know exactly what is happening, you idiot," Richard snapped. "The bank froze our assets because of the toxic debt attached to your inheritance. The trusts are tied to Thorn Transit. We cannot access our money until Thorn Transit is legally dissolved and the liability is written off by the bank." One of the corporate lawyers stepped up to the small wooden desk. He did not introduce himself. He simply popped open his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slapped them down onto the desk right next to my flashlight. "Mr. Thorne," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with practiced intimidation, "we represent your brother and sister. This situation is entirely a clerical error on the part of your late father's estate planning. However, it is currently causing a catastrophic financial blockage for my clients. We have drafted an irrevocable assignment of rights and a total renunciation of inheritance." The lawyer clicked an expensive silver pen and placed it on top of the documents. "By signing these papers, you are legally transferring 100% ownership of Thorne Transit and all its associated liabilities directly to a liquidation firm controlled by Mr. Kensington. You will be completely free of the $400,000 debt, and the bank will immediately release the freeze on the family trusts." I looked at the documents. It was a complete surrender. They wanted me to hand over the very company my father had used to construct this entire trap. If I signed those papers, I would lose the corporate entity that connected me to Oakstone Financial Holdings. I would be giving them the key to their own salvation and permanently locking myself out of the $50 million empire my father had built. "I'm not signing anything," I said, crossing my arms. "Thorne Transit belongs to me. Dad left it to me for a reason." Sarah let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. "For a reason?" she mocked, stepping toward me. "Elias, do not be an absolute fool. He left it to you because he knew you were too stupid to realize it was a death trap. You are living in a slum. You smell like a dumpster. You lost your wife and you lost your job. You cannot afford to keep a company that is $500,000 in the red. We are literally trying to save you from going to federal bankruptcy court." I looked at Sarah, completely unfazed by her insults. "If you are trying to save me, why do you look so terrified?" I asked. Bradley slammed his fist onto the wooden desk, making the flashlight rattle. "Because you are dragging us down with you," he roared. "My real estate empire is built on cash flow, Elias. If I do not have access to my capital by the end of the day, my lenders are going to start calling my loans. I could lose the Oak Creek development. I am not going to let a pathetic broke ambulance driver destroy my life just because you want to play businessman." Richard reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a long rectangular piece of paper. He held it up so I could see it. It was a certified bank check. "We knew you would try to be difficult," Richard said, his voice turning cold and transactional. "We know you are completely desperate. Brenda told us she forced the sale of your house. We know the hospital fired you. You have absolutely nothing left. So we are going to make this very simple for you." Richard tossed the certified check onto the desk. It landed right on top of the legal surrender documents. I looked down at the paper. It was made out to my name. The amount was exactly $50,000. $50,000, Richard said, leaning in close to my face. "That is more money than you make in a year breaking your back on the night shift. That is enough money to pay off the predatory loan you took out for the funeral. It is enough money to rent a decent apartment and buy a used car so you do not have to sleep in the back of a junked ambulance anymore." Bradley crossed his arms, looking at me with absolute disdain. "Take the $50,000 and get out of our lives, Elias. You are not smart enough to play these legal games, you piece of trash ambulance driver. You are out of your depth. You do not understand corporate finance. You do not understand cross-collateralization. Take the money, sign the paper, and walk away before we decide to crush you in civil court for intentional financial sabotage." I looked down at the check. $50,000. Just a week ago, that amount of money would have changed my entire life. It would have saved my marriage. It would have kept my house. It would have allowed me to bury my father with dignity instead of begging a funeral director for mercy in the pouring rain. They were throwing it at me now like a scrap of meat thrown to a starving dog. They thought my pride could be bought. They thought they could silence me with pocket change while they walked away with tens of millions of dollars that did not belong to them. They thought I was the exact same broken man who had stood crying in the cemetery, but I was not that man anymore. I had read the ledger. I knew the truth about the Oak Creek development. I knew Bradley did not own the land beneath his massive shopping mall. I knew my father holding company owned it, and I knew Bradley had defaulted on the 99-year ground lease. I knew Richard Kensington had sold $30 million of toxic hedge fund debt directly to my father, and that I now held the legal right to call that debt and force Richard into federal bankruptcy. They were standing in my room, calling me a piece of trash, completely unaware that I was holding the absolute power of life and death over their entire financial existence. I looked at the high-powered lawyers standing by the door. I looked at Sarah, who was vibrating with anxious energy. I looked at Bradley, whose face was red with arrogant fury. And then I looked at Richard Kensington, who was smiling a thin, victorious smile, fully believing he had just bought his way out of a disaster. I reached out and picked up the certified check. I held the crisp, heavy paper between my fingers. Bradley exhaled a loud sigh of relief. Sarah visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping. One of the corporate lawyers stepped forward and uncapped his expensive silver pen, offering it to me to sign the surrender documents. "Good choice," Richard said, adjusting his tie. "Now sign the paperwork and we can all pretend you never existed." I did not take the pen. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, maintaining a dead, unwavering stare. I gripped the left edge of the $50,000 check with my thumb and index finger. I gripped the right edge with my other hand, and in one slow, deliberate motion, I tore the check straight down the middle. The sharp, ripping sound of the thick paper filled the dead silence of the freezing room. I placed the two torn halves directly on top of the legal document. Then I picked them up again, stacked them together, and tore them a second time, ripping the $50,000 bribe into 4 worthless pieces of scrap paper. I let the pieces flutter down onto the desk. The silence in the room became absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy silence. The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from Richard's face, replaced by a look of profound, genuine shock. Sarah gasped, taking a physical step backward as if I had just pulled a weapon on her. Bradley's jaw dropped open, his eyes locked on the shredded pieces of the certified check. The corporate lawyers froze perfectly still, clearly not anticipating this reaction from a desperate homeless man. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that I had never possessed before in my life. "You think $50,000 is enough to buy my father's legacy?" I asked, staring at the horrified faces of my family. "You left him to die. You left me to bury him in the mud. You laughed at me when I lost everything. And now you walk into my room and demand that I save you from a trap you walked into with your own greed." I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the wooden desk right next to the shredded check. "I am not signing your paperwork," I whispered. "I am keeping Thorn Transit. I am keeping the debt. And I am going to sit right here and watch the bank rip your entire fake world to pieces. Now get out of my room." The color completely drained from Bradley's face. For the first time in his life, he was looking at his younger brother, and he was truly, genuinely afraid. I watched the door of my freezing boarding house room slam shut behind them. The sound echoed down the decaying hallway. The shredded pieces of the $50,000 check were scattered across the wooden desk like confetti. I had won the battle in this room, but I knew the war was far from over. Bradley and Richard Kensington were cornered animals. Men like them did not just walk away when their millions were on the line. They did not accept defeat from a man they considered a peasant. They were going to retaliate. I just did not realize how unimaginably vicious their next move would be. I sat back down at the desk and pulled out my phone. I needed to act fast. I had the ledger. I had the bearer shares for Oakstone Financial Holdings. I had the ground lease for the Oak Creek Mall and the toxic debt notes for Richard's hedge fund. But I was still a guy sitting in a rundown motel with no legal representation and no money in my checking account. I needed an ally. I dialed the only person who actually understood what my father had done. I called Mr. Abernathy. The phone rang twice before the old lawyer answered. His voice was hushed. "Elias, you should not be calling my personal cell phone. Your brother and sister have retained the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state. They are currently ripping my office apart, trying to find a loophole in your father's estate planning. I have the ledger." I said, my voice low and urgent. "I found the safety deposit box. I know about Oakstone Financial Holdings. I know about the commercial land lease and the hedge fund debt. Dad set them up. He gave me the kill switch. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Your father was a brilliant man, Elias. He knew you were the only one with the integrity to handle the truth. But you need to listen to me very carefully. Richard Kensington just called a highly connected judge who plays golf at his country club. They are filing an emergency petition right now. I do not know exactly what the petition is, but they are bypassing the standard probate courts. They are trying to strip your legal standing before the banks open on Tuesday. You need to get out of that room. You need to hide until we can file a protective injunction. Before Abernathy could finish his sentence, I heard the sound of heavy tires screeching to a halt on the street outside my window. I stood up and peered through the dirty glass. 2 black and white police cruisers were parked directly in front of the boarding house. The flashing red and blue lights painted the brick walls of the building. Right behind the cruisers, a familiar silver SUV pulled up to the curb. It was Brenda, my estranged wife. My blood ran completely cold. Why was Brenda here with the police? I have to go, I told Abernathy. The police are outside. Elias, whatever you do, do not let them take you from the premises. Abernathy warned, his voice suddenly filled with genuine terror. Do not give them a reason to put you in a vehicle. The line went dead. I shoved my phone into my pocket. I grabbed the black leather ledger and the legal documents, shoved them into my duffel bag, and kicked the bag under the stained mattress of the twin bed. I barely had time to stand up straight before heavy fists began pounding on my splintered door. Elias Thorne opened the door. This is the Detroit Police Department. I took a deep breath, raised my hands to show I was not a threat, and slowly opened the door. Standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway were 2 uniformed police officers with their hands resting casually on their duty belts. Behind them stood a middle-aged woman wearing a lanyard identifying her as a county social worker, and standing safely behind the wall of authority was Brenda. She was holding a crumpled tissue to her face, acting like a terrified, heartbroken wife. What is going on here, officer? I asked, keeping my voice remarkably steady. I have not committed any crime. Are you Elias Thorne? The taller officer asked, looking me up and down. He took note of my wrinkled suit, my pale face, and the freezing rundown room behind me. Yes, I am Elias Thorne, I replied. The social worker stepped forward, holding a thick clipboard. Mr. Thorne, my name is Janice. We have received an emergency call regarding your mental stability and physical well-being. We are here to execute a temporary 72-hour psychiatric hold and an emergency medical conservatorship order signed by a county judge just 20 minutes ago. The words hit me like a physical punch to the gut. An emergency medical conservatorship. I was a paramedic. I knew exactly what that meant. It was the absolute ultimate weapon in the American legal system. If they placed me under a psychiatric hold, I would be declared legally incompetent. All of my civil rights would be instantly suspended. I would not be allowed to sign a contract, make a phone call, or touch a bank account, and the person who filed the petition would be granted total emergency control over all my assets. Who filed this petition? I demanded, my voice rising just a fraction before I forced it back down. I knew showing anger would only prove their fake allegations. I did. Elias, Brenda said, stepping out from behind the officers. Her voice was shaking with manufactured grief. Her performance was terrifyingly convincing. She looked at the social worker with tear-filled eyes. Look at him, Janice. Just look at how he is living. He is completely disconnected from reality. Brenda took a step closer to the door, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. He has completely lost his mind since his father died last week, she cried. He drained our joint bank accounts, paying for useless medical treatments. He took out a massive high-interest predatory loan just to buy a fancy funeral casket, because he is having delusions of grandeur. He signed over the deed to our family home and willingly made himself homeless. And last night he broke into a medical facility and slept on a metal table in the back of a biohazard ambulance. I stared at her in absolute horror. She was weaponizing every single tragedy they had forced upon me. They had created the circumstances that drove me to the brink, and now they were using my survival tactics as proof of my insanity. Officer, I am perfectly sane, I said, turning my attention to the police. I was evicted from my home by this woman. I am currently between residences. I am a licensed paramedic in this city. You can check my credentials. I am not a threat to myself or anyone else." Janice, the social worker, flipped a page on her clipboard. "Mr. Thorne, your brother Bradley and your sister Sarah have also provided sworn affidavits corroborating your wife's statements. They stated that they came to this motel earlier today to offer you a $50,000 check to help you get back on your feet. They claim you experienced a violent psychotic break, screamed at them, and tore the money into shreds." Janice looked past my shoulder and pointed her pen at the wooden desk. The shredded pieces of Richard's certified check were still sitting exactly where I had left them. The taller police officer placed his hand firmly on the doorframe, blocking any chance of me closing it. "Tearing up 50 grand when you are living in a freezing slum does not sound like the behavior of a rational man, buddy. We have a judge order. You need to come with us to the county hospital right now. We can do this the easy way, or we can put you in cuffs." The sheer absolute brilliance of Richard Kensington's plan washed over me. He knew I would tear up that check. He wanted me to tear it up. He provoked me into rejecting his bribe so he could use the shredded pieces of paper as undeniable legal proof that I was mentally incompetent. No sane person living in poverty destroys a guaranteed $50,000. Unless they are crazy, or unless they know they are sitting on $50 million. But I could not tell the police about Oakstone Financial Holdings. I had no legal representation present. If I started ranting about secret hedge fund debt and hidden commercial land leases while standing in a freezing slum, I would sound exactly like a paranoid schizophrenic. I would be doing their job for them. Brenda wiped a fake tear from her cheek. "Please, Elias," she whimpered. "Just let the doctors help you. Bradley and Sarah love you. We all love you. We just want you to get the psychiatric care you desperately need. We will manage the estate and your father's trucking company while you are resting. You will not have to worry about any of the debt. We will take the burden off your shoulders." There it was, the ultimate dagger. The second the heavy doors of the psychiatric ward locked behind me, Brenda and my siblings would use the emergency conservatorship to sign the renunciation documents on my behalf. They would legally surrender Thorne Transit back to the bank. The cross-collateralization would be completely severed. Their frozen millions would be released, and the secret $50 million Oakstone empire would dissolve into the ether, completely out of my reach forever. They would strip my father's trap down to the studs and throw me into a mental institution to rot. I looked at the officers. Their faces were stern. They were just doing their jobs. They saw a broken man in a ruined suit, a crying wife, and a shredded check. To them, this was a textbook mental health crisis. "Officers," I said, keeping my hands perfectly still and visible, "I know what a Section 5150 mental health hold is. I know the legal requirements. You need probable cause that I am in immediate physical danger to myself or to others. Tearing up a check is an expression of anger, not a symptom of psychosis. My wife and I are in the middle of a highly contentious divorce involving substantial disputed assets. This petition is a fraudulent legal maneuver designed to seize my property." Janice shook her head, looking at me with annoying professional pity. "Mr. Thorne, paranoia and believing your family is conspiring against you are classic signs of a severe stress-induced break. Your family is wealthy. You are living in a condemned building without heat. The judge found the disparity highly concerning. You must come with us for an evaluation. If I walk out this door, I lose everything I thought rapidly. I could not fight them physically. I could not run. I had to use the only weapon I had left, the very profession they used to mock me, my paramedic training." I took a slow, deliberate step back from the doorframe, maintaining direct eye contact with the social worker. "Janice, you are a mandatory reporter under state law, correct?" I asked. My tone shifted completely. I stopped sounding like a victim and started sounding exactly like a medical professional conducting a field assessment. "Yes," she said, slightly taken aback by my sudden shift in demeanor. "But that does not change the judge's order." "Actually, it changes everything," I said, my voice projecting total authority. Under the State Welfare and Institutions Code, an emergency conservatorship order, granted ex parte, can only be executed if the subject is unable to articulate their own basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. Furthermore, as a mandatory reporter, if you receive credible, actionable evidence that this psychiatric hold is being used to facilitate elder abuse, estate fraud, or financial extortion, you are legally required to halt the intake and request an independent ombudsman review. The taller police officer frowned, looking at Janice. "Is that true?" he asked. Janice looked slightly unsure. "I mean, yes, but we have a judge signature based on sworn family testimony." "Sworn family testimony from a brother who is currently under active investigation for commercial loan default," I countered quickly, firing the words like bullets. "My brother Bradley Thorne has defaulted on a commercial land lease for the Oak Creek shopping mall. My brother-in-law Richard Kensington is currently managing a hedge fund carrying $30 million in toxic mezzanine debt that my father holding company currently owns." Brenda's face instantly went pale. She did not know about the debt. Richard and Bradley had kept her in the dark. They had just used her as the emotional prop to get the police to the door. "Shut up, Elias," Brenda yelled, dropping the crying act completely. Her voice was shrill and vicious. "Stop making up these insane lies. Officer, grab him. Put the cuffs on him right now. He is completely delusional." I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Janice. "Call the First National Bank downtown," I said, pointing to the phone in the social worker's hand. "Ask for the Commercial Asset Division. Ask them if Bradley Thorne and Sarah Kensington had all of their personal trust funds frozen this morning due to cross-collateralization with my inheritance. Ask them if Richard Kensington is facing a liquidity crisis. If I am crazy, then the bank will tell you I am making this up. But if I am telling the truth, then you are participating in a multi-million-dollar federal financial fraud and you will lose your license and face federal conspiracy charges by the end of the day." The hallway went completely silent. The only sound was the howling wind rattling the broken window in my room. The police officers looked at each other. They were street cops used to dealing with domestic disputes and drug addicts. They were not equipped to handle high-level corporate finance fraud. The mention of federal conspiracy charges and frozen trust funds made them instantly hesitant. Cops hate being used as pawns in rich people lawsuits. Janice looked down at her clipboard. Her professional confidence was severely shaken. The calm, articulate way I had dismantled her assessment did not match the profile of a man having a psychotic break. A crazy man yells. A crazy man fights. A crazy man does not quote the Welfare and Institutions Code and demand a bank verification. Brenda stepped forward, grabbing the officer's arm. "Do not listen to him," she shrieked. "He is manipulating you. He is a smooth talker. He is crazy. You have the order. Take him." "Ma'am, step back," the taller officer said sharply, pulling his arm away from Brenda. He turned to the social worker. "Janice, we cannot drag a guy out of his room if he is coherent and claiming financial extortion. If we put hands on him and he is right about the bank stuff, we are all going out on a liability limb." "I am perfectly coherent," I said, stepping forward slightly, my hands still visible. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but my voice was completely steady. "I know the date. I know the president. I know my social security number. I am refusing the psychiatric hold. If you force me out of this room, you are violating my civil rights under the Fourth Amendment. I am requesting an immediate administrative hearing, and I want my refusal formally documented on your incident report." Janice stared at me for a long, terrifying moment. She looked at Brenda, who was practically foaming at the mouth with rage. The contrast was undeniable. I was standing perfectly still, completely rational, while Brenda looked like a hysterical maniac. Janice sighed and clicked her pen. "Mr. Thorne?" she said, her voice tight with caution. "I am going to document your refusal. I am also going to document your allegations of financial fraud. We are leaving the premises. However, This does not invalidate the petition. The judge has scheduled a formal conservatorship hearing for 9 o'clock on Monday morning. You must appear in court to defend your competency. If you fail to appear, the judge will grant the conservatorship to your family by default. I will be there, I said. The officers nodded to me. They did not say a word to Brenda. They turned around and walked down the creaking hallway, leaving the social worker to follow them. Brenda stood frozen in the doorway, staring at me with a look of absolute horror. She realized her performance had failed. She realized she had just completely exposed herself to the wrath of the man she had betrayed. "You should not have done this, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "You should have just taken the house and walked away. You are going to lose Elias." She spat, her voice shaking with fear and hatred. "Richard has the best lawyers in the state. They are going to obliterate you in that courtroom on Monday. You are going to end up in a straitjacket." She turned around and ran down the stairs, her high heels clicking loudly against the rotting wood. I slowly closed the splintered door and locked the deadbolt. I leaned my back against the wood and slid down until I hit the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, gasping for air as the sheer adrenaline finally crashed. I had survived by a fraction of an inch. They had tried to steal my mind, to steal my money. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed Mr. Abernathy. He answered on the first ring. "They tried to take me," I said, my chest heaving. "Brenda came with the police and a social worker. They filed an emergency conservatorship. I talked my way out of it, but the hearing is on Monday morning." Abernathy let out a long breath. "Thank God you are safe, Elias. I have been drafting a counter motion for the last hour. If they want to play dirty in a courtroom, we are going to give them a war they will never forget. But you have to bring the ledger. You have to bring every single document your father left in that bank box." I looked at my duffel bag hiding under the stained mattress. "I have everything I need," I said, my voice turning hard and cold. "I will see you at the courthouse on Monday. It is time to drop the hammer." I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B at the Wayne County Probate Court exactly at 8:55 on Monday morning. The air inside the room was stiff and formal, smelling of polished wood and floor wax. I walked down the center aisle wearing the same wrinkled suit I had been sleeping in all weekend. I carried my heavy canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder. Sitting at the petitioner's table on the left side of the room was my entire family. They looked like they had arrived for a victory parade rather than a psychiatric hearing. Bradley was wearing a sharp navy blue custom suit, leaning back in his chair with his arm draped casually over the backrest. Sarah sat next to him wearing a pristine white designer dress, casually scrolling through her phone. Richard Kensington sat beside his wife, checking his gold Rolex with a look of supreme boredom. And sitting right at the front, closest to the judge bench, was my estranged wife, Brenda. She was wearing a conservative black dress, holding a crumpled tissue in her hand, ready to play the role of the terrified, heartbroken spouse. When they saw me walk into the courtroom, Bradley let out a loud, mocking scoff. He nudged Richard and pointed at my duffel bag. Richard smirked and shook his head, looking at me with absolute disgust. They truly believed I was walking in to surrender. They thought I was a broken homeless man bringing my last few possessions into a courtroom right before the judge locked me away in a psychiatric ward and handed them the keys to my father's estate. I did not look at them. I walked to the respondent's table on the right side of the room and set my duffel bag down on the wooden surface. I unzipped the canvas top and waited. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Marcus Harrison. We all stood as the judge, a stern-looking man with silver hair and a deeply lined face, took his seat at the bench. He opened the thick file in front of him and adjusted his reading glasses. "We are here today for an emergency conservatorship hearing regarding Mr. Elias Thorne." The judge said, his voice booming through the quiet room. The petition was filed by his legal spouse, Brenda Thorne, with supporting affidavits from his biological siblings, Bradley Thorne and Sarah Thorne Kensington. The petitioners are requesting immediate suspension of Mr. Thorne's civil and financial rights, citing a severe psychological break. The high-powered corporate lawyer sitting next to Brenda stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. "Your Honor, My name is David Sterling, representing the petitioners. We are asking the court to grant full emergency conservatorship to my clients today. The subject, Elias Thorne, has experienced a catastrophic mental collapse following the death of his father. He has recklessly signed away his marital home. He has taken out massive predatory loans. He has been terminated from his medical employment for erratic behavior. Over the weekend, he broke into a biohazard medical vehicle to sleep on a metal stretcher. When his loving family approached him in a squalid boarding house to offer him a $50,000 lifeline, he experienced a violent delusion and tore the money into pieces. He is entirely incapable of managing his own survival, let alone the complex commercial estate he recently inherited. We respectfully request that he be remanded to a psychiatric facility for his own safety, so his family can properly manage his financial obligations. The lawyer sat down, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Brenda dabbed her dry eyes with her tissue, letting out a loud theatrical sob. Sarah reached over and patted Brenda on the shoulder, nodding in fake sympathy. Bradley was smiling openly now, entirely confident that the legal execution was complete. Judge Harrison looked down at me from the bench. His expression was serious and unreadable. Mr. Thorne, you are completely unrepresented by legal counsel today. Given the severe nature of these allegations and the sworn testimony of your entire family asking me to declare you legally incompetent, what exactly do you have to say for yourself? I looked at the judge. Then I looked at Brenda Bradley, Sarah, and Richard. They were all staring at me, waiting for me to beg. They were waiting for me to rant and rave about secret bank accounts and hidden debts so they could point at me and call me crazy. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out the heavy black leather ledger. I placed it gently on the wooden table. Then I pulled out the stack of brittle legal documents. Your Honor, I am not unrepresented, I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the courtroom. The moment the words left my mouth, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud metallic crash. Everyone in the room turned around. Walking down the center aisle was Mr. Abernathy, my father's longtime estate attorney. He was wearing a sharp charcoal suit and carrying a massive leather briefcase. But he was not alone. Walking briskly directly behind him were 3 men and 1 woman wearing severe dark suits, carrying official federal credentials clipped to their belts. They moved with a terrifying coordinated purpose. Bradley's smug smile instantly vanished. He sat up straight, his brow furrowing in confusion. Richard Kensington dropped his hand from his watch, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the federal badges. Mr. Abernathy walked right past the petitioner's table, ignoring my siblings completely. He stepped up to my table and stood directly beside me, facing the judge. Your Honor, my name is Thomas Abernathy, he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. I am the executor of the late Richard Thorne estate, and I am acting as co-counsel for Elias Thorne today. Furthermore, I would like to introduce Special Agent Miller and her team from the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They are here today observing this hearing at my specific request. The judge lowered his glasses, clearly caught off guard by the sudden escalation. Mr. Abernathy, this is a standard probate and conservatorship hearing. Why exactly are federal agents present in my courtroom? Because, Your Honor, this petition is not a matter of mental health, I said, stepping forward and picking up the black leather ledger. This petition is a desperate, legally fraudulent attempt to execute a multi-million-dollar financial extortion scheme. My family did not file this conservatorship because I am crazy. They filed it because they are entirely bankrupt and I am the man who currently holds their debt. Brenda shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. He is lying, she screamed, pointing at me. Look at him. Your Honor, he is making up crazy conspiracy theories again. He is completely out of his mind. Sit down, Mrs. Thorne, the judge barked, banging his gavel once. I will hear from the respondent. Proceed, Mr. Thorne. I opened the ledger to the exact center page. Your Honor, when my father passed away, he left my brother and sister the Thorne family trusts. He left me a failing trucking company called Thorn Transit carrying $400,000 in commercial debt. My siblings believed I was ruined. They mocked me. My brother-in-law, Richard Kensington, deliberately used his influence to have me fired from my paramedic job, trying to force me to renounce my inheritance. I turned and locked eyes with Richard. His face had gone completely pale. He was staring at the black ledger in my hands as if it were a live grenade. What they did not know, I continued projecting my voice so every single federal agent in the back of the room could hear every word, is that the $400,000 debt was entirely fabricated. My father used a legal cross-collateralization loophole to tie the empty family trusts to the trucking company. But he did not owe the bank any money. He owed the money to a holding company he secretly created 30 years ago. A company called Oakstone Financial Holdings. I picked up the heavy watermarked bearer share document from the stack of papers and handed it to the bailiff, who brought it up to the judge. I am the sole proprietor and legal owner of Oakstone Financial Holdings, I said. And over the last 3 decades, my father used this company to quietly buy up the physical assets and the toxic debts of the very people sitting at that table. I turned fully to face my brother. Bradley was gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. He was sweating heavily. "Let us start with you, Bradley," I said, my voice turning ice cold. "You have spent the last 3 years bragging about your multi-billion-dollar commercial real estate empire. You built the Oak Creek shopping mall. You built luxury condominiums. You call yourself a titan of industry. But you do not own the dirt under your own buildings." Bradley stood up his chair, tipping over backward and crashing to the floor. "Shut up, Elias," he yelled, his voice shaking with absolute panic. "This is a joke. Your Honor, he is fabricating this." I handed a copy of the 99-year commercial ground lease to the bailiff. "Your Honor, my brother operates his entire real estate empire on a ground lease that was secretly purchased by Oakstone Financial Holdings 5 years ago. Per the strict covenants of that lease, a balloon payment of $5 million was due precisely 7 days after the death of the primary title holder. That deadline passed yesterday at midnight. My brother has officially defaulted on the lease for his flagship property." I looked Bradley dead in the eyes. "I am officially executing the default penalty clause right now in this courtroom," I said, my words striking him like physical blows. "I am seizing all physical improvements constructed on the Oak Creek property. Your mall, your retail spaces, and your luxury condominiums now belong entirely to me. Your real estate empire is officially suspended and you are legally evicted from the premises." Bradley let out a horrific gasping sound. His knees buckled completely. He collapsed, grabbing the edge of the table to stop himself from hitting the floor. His wife Chloe grabbed his arm, screaming his name, but he could not speak. He was hyperventilating, staring at me with a look of total, absolute destruction. He had spent his entire life looking down on me, and with one piece of paper I had just taken everything he had ever built. I did not stop. I did not show an ounce of mercy. I turned my attention directly to Richard Kensington. Richard had already stood up. He was quietly trying to pack his briefcase, his hands trembling violently. He was trying to sneak out of the courtroom before the federal agents at the back of the room made their move. "Going somewhere, Richard?" asked, my voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. Richard froze, his back stiffening. He slowly turned around, his face devoid of all blood. His arrogant, wealthy facade had completely melted away, leaving only a terrified, cornered criminal. "Your Honor," I said, picking up the thick stack of promissory notes from the table. 5 years ago, Richard Kensington lost $30 million of his investors' money in a series of highly reckless trades. To hide his insolvency and avoid federal prosecution, he took out $30 million in toxic mezzanine debt. He sold high-yield corporate bonds to a private equity firm in Chicago, expecting to buy himself time. I walked forward, stopping just a few feet away from where Richard was standing. He could not look me in the eye. He was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed. But the Chicago firm did not keep the debt. I said, my voice ringing with total, absolute victory. They sold it silently to Oakstone Financial Holdings. Richard, my father bought your debt. My father owned your hedge fund, and today I own it. I turned back to the judge and held the promissory notes high in the air. Your Honor, these mezzanine debt notes carry a strict immediate call provision. As the primary debt holder, I am officially executing the call provision on all $30 million, effectively immediately. Richard Kensington does not have the liquidity to satisfy this call. His hedge fund is completely insolvent. The moment I said the word insolvent, the SEC agents at the back of the room began walking rapidly down the center aisle. They bypassed the wooden gate and walked directly into the trial area surrounding Richard. Richard Kensington, the lead female SEC agent, said, her voice sharp and authoritative. We have been reviewing the Oakstone financial logs provided by Mr. Abernathy over the weekend. We have confirmed massive discrepancies in your quarterly investor reports. You have been actively hiding a $30 million deficit from your shareholders and manipulating corporate disclosures to secure additional funding. The two FBI agents stepped up directly behind Richard. One of them pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Richard Kensington, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial extortion, the FBI agent said, grabbing Richard by the arms and spinning him around. No, you cannot do this. Richard stammered, his voice cracking as the cold steel cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. I have money. I have lawyers. Elias, tell them to stop. Please, Elias, you do not understand what you are doing. I understand exactly what I am doing, Richard, I replied, staring at him coldly as the agent secured his arms behind his back. I am showing you reality. You told me I was a nobody. You told me I had no leverage. Now you are going to federal prison and your entire fake life is over. Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. She lunged forward, grabbing her heavy designer handbag and hurling it across the courtroom. It smashed into a wooden podium, scattering papers everywhere. You ruined us! She shrieked, pointing a shaking claw-like hand at me. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, her face twisted in a mask of absolute rage and terror. You planned this, you evil piece of trash! You stole our money! You set us up! I did not steal anything, Sarah, I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through her hysterical screaming. Dad set you up. He knew exactly how greedy you were. He knew you would leave him to die, and he knew you would try to destroy me the second he was gone. He gave you empty trusts, and you were too arrogant to realize you were completely broke. Sarah completely lost her mind. She swept her arm across the petitioner's table, knocking heavy glass water pitchers and metal trays crashing to the floor. Water spilled everywhere, soaking into the carpet. She fell to her knees, weeping hysterically, clawing at her own dress as the reality of her total, sudden poverty finally crashed down on her. She had no country club. She had no mansion. Her husband was in handcuffs and she was entirely bankrupt. Brenda, my estranged wife, who had locked me out of our home just days ago, was standing backed against the wall. She was trembling so violently, she looked like she was vibrating. She was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing she had just divorced a man who was now worth $50 million. She had thrown away her entire future for a plane ticket to Rome. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order in the completely chaotic courtroom. Order! He shouted, his voice booming over Sarah screaming and Bradley hyperventilating on the floor. I will have order in my court right now. The FBI agents ignored the noise physically dragging a sobbing, pleading Richard Kensington down the center aisle and out of the heavy double doors. The SEC agents began collecting the files from the opposing lawyer's desk. The corporate attorney who had tried to force me to sign the surrender documents was rapidly packing his briefcase, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, clearly terrified of being implicated in a federal fraud conspiracy. Judge Harrison looked down at Brenda, who was still shaking against the wall. Mrs. Thorne, the judge said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. I am denying your petition for an emergency conservatorship. I am also submitting a formal recommendation to the district attorney to investigate you for filing a fraudulent legal petition and committing perjury in my courtroom. I suggest you retain criminal defense counsel immediately." Brenda let out a small, pathetic whimper and covered her face with her hands, sliding down the wall until she was sitting on the floor next to a puddle of spilled water. Judge Harrison turned his attention to me. He looked at the black ledger sitting on the table. He looked at the confident, sharp posture of Mr. Abernathy standing beside me. And then he looked at me, a paramedic in a ruined suit who had just systematically dismantled a corporate empire in less than 10 minutes. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his tone completely shifting from stern authority to profound professional respect. "Your father was a very shrewd man. It appears he left his legacy in highly capable hands. You are free to go." I picked up the black leather ledger and placed it carefully back into my canvas duffel bag. I zipped it shut. I looked at Bradley, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping quietly into his hands. I looked at Sarah, who was rocking back and forth, surrounded by shattered glass. I looked at Brenda, who could not even lift her head to look at me. They had tried to bury me. They had tried to strip my dignity, my freedom, and my life. But my father had taught me how to read the fine print. I slung the heavy canvas bag over my shoulder, turned my back on my completely destroyed family, and walked out of the courtroom. Exactly 1 month passed since the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B swung shut. The federal financial investigation swept through the city with brutal efficiency. Richard Kensington was denied bail. He sat in a federal detention center waiting for a trial that would undoubtedly send him to prison for a very long time. The Securities and Exchange Commission completely dismantled his hedge fund, seizing every single bank account, every offshore trust, and every physical asset attached to his name. My sister Sarah went from organizing high society charity galas in designer dresses to standing in a federal bankruptcy court wearing sweatpants. The government seized her vacation home in the Hamptons. They seized her jewelry, her cars, and the massive bank accounts she thought she had secured. She was completely wiped out. My brother Bradley suffered a completely different kind of destruction. Once the court officially verified my execution of the default penalty on the Oak Creek commercial ground lease, his real estate empire completely imploded. The banks immediately called all of his outstanding loans. The contractors walked off the job sites. His investors filed massive class action lawsuits against him for gross financial negligence. Within 2 weeks, his firm filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The moment the money evaporated, his beloved wife Chloe packed her designer bags and filed for divorce, demanding half of whatever crumbs he had left. Bradley was forced to move into a run-down, dilapidated apartment complex on the industrial side of Detroit. It was located just 3 blocks away from the exact same freezing boarding house he had stormed into when he tried to force me to surrender. The irony was absolutely perfect. I was sitting in my newly leased apartment reviewing the final liquidation documents with Mr. Abernathy when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I picked it up and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Brenda. It was a massive block of text dripping with manufactured remorse and desperate panic. She wrote, "Elias, I am so sorry for everything I said at the cemetery. I was just acting out of stress because of the financial pressure. I never wanted to hurt you. I realize now that I made a terrible mistake letting my lawyer push me into that forced sale. I canceled the trip to Rome. I miss you so much. I know we can fix our marriage if you just give me one more chance to show you how much I care. Please, Elias, let me come home to you." I read the message twice. A month ago, that text would have broken my heart. A month ago, I would have believed she was actually sorry. But my father had given me the greatest gift a man could ever receive. He had given me the power to see through the masks. Brenda did not miss me. Brenda missed the $50 million I had just inherited. She had realized her grave mistake, and she was trying to claw her way back to the bank vault using my emotions as a crowbar. I did not text her back with anger. I simply sent a single reply to a group chat containing Brenda Bradley and Sarah. "Meet me at the cemetery tomorrow at noon," I typed. "We need to finalize the estate." The next day, the Detroit sky was clear and bitterly cold. The rain and mud that had plagued my father's funeral were gone, replaced by a hard, freezing frost. I stood silently at the foot of his grave wearing a thick wool coat. I did not have to wait long. Bradley was the first to arrive. He drove a beat-up 10-year-old sedan that sputtered and coughed as he parked it near the gates. He walked across the frozen grass looking like a completely broken man. His shoulders were slumped, his face was unshaven, and the expensive custom suits were gone, replaced by a cheap faded jacket. Sarah arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of a rideshare vehicle. She looked exhausted, her face pale and devoid of makeup. Brenda was the last to walk up the path. She tried to offer me a weak, pathetic smile, but I stared right through her. The three of them stood in front of me, shivering in the cold. They looked at the fresh headstone bearing my father's name, and then they looked at me. The arrogant smirks, the cruel laughter, and the vicious insults were entirely gone. Elias Bradley started, his voice cracking with humiliation. "I am losing my mind." Chloe took the last of the cash in the divorce settlement. "The lawyers are draining me dry. I cannot even afford rent next month. I know I said horrible things to you. I know I treated you like garbage. But you have $50 million now. You own my commercial land. Just write me a check. Give me $1 million so I can settle these lawsuits and start over. I am your brother Elias. You cannot leave me like this." Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. She reached out, trying to grab my arm, but I took a step back. "Elias, please," she begged, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "Richard is gone. The government took my house. I have absolutely nothing left. My friends at the country club will not even return my phone calls. You have the Thorn Transit money. You have the hedge fund settlement. You have to help me. I am family." Brenda stepped up next to them, twisting her hands together nervously. "Elias, we can rebuild," she whispered. "You do not have to be alone in all of this wealth. I am your wife. We took vows. Just let me come back and we can share this life together the way we always planned." I stood perfectly still, letting the freezing wind whip across the cemetery. I looked at the three people who had actively tried to destroy my life when they thought I had nothing. I remembered the heavy mud on my shoes when the funeral director threatened to throw my father into a freezer. I remembered Bradley laughing from a ski resort in Aspen, telling me to pay the bill myself. I remembered Sarah telling me she did not have time to play the poor family game. I remembered Brenda shoving a court order into my chest so she could fly to Rome. I looked down at my father's headstone. Then I looked directly at my brother. "You wanted the glory of being the rich real estate tycoon," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm. "You wanted the millions. You got exactly what you deserved." I turned my eyes to Sarah. "You told me I chose a blue-collar life, and that caring for our father was my mess to clean up." I said, my words slicing through the freezing air like broken glass. "You told me to handle it yourself." I finally looked at Brenda. Her pathetic, hopeful smile completely dissolved under my cold stare. "You told me I was a worthless paramedic who could not save his own life," I said. "You wanted me out on the street so you could move on with a winner." "Elias, please," Brenda sobbed. "I was wrong." I took a step forward, looking at all three of them. "When I stood on this exact spot 1 month ago, begging for $12,000 to put our father in the earth, you all laughed at me," I said, my voice rising with absolute finality. "You stripped me of my dignity. You stripped me of my home. You tried to throw me in a psychiatric ward to steal what my father left me. Now you come crawling back because the very trap you walked into finally snapped shut." Bradley fell to his knees on the frozen grass, putting his face in his hands. Sarah covered her mouth, weeping loudly. "You want me to save you?" I asked, staring down at them. "You want me to open my checkbook and fix your horrible financial planning?" I paused, letting the absolute silence of the cemetery wash over them. "Not my problem," I said. I delivered the exact same 3 words Bradley had thrown at me on the worst day of my life. I watched the realization hit them. They knew it was over. There would be no rescue. There would be no forgiveness. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, navigated to Brenda's contact profile, and deleted her number right in front of her face. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked down the asphalt path toward my car, leaving them alone in the freezing cold to face the ruins of the lives they had destroyed with their own greed. The following week, I sat in Mr. Abernathy's office and officially signed the liquidation papers. I sold the Oak Creek commercial land to a massive national development firm. I dissolved Oakstone Financial Holdings and liquidated the recovered bonds from the Kensington hedge fund. When the final wire transfers cleared my new bank accounts, the total net worth of my father's hidden empire came out to just over $52 million. I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I could have bought a penthouse in Manhattan. I could have bought a fleet of custom sports cars and vacationed in Aspen just like Bradley. I could have bought my way into the most elite country clubs in the state. But I was a paramedic. I knew what it felt like to hold a dying person in my arms while they worried about how their family was going to pay the hospital bill. I knew what it felt like to be pushed to the absolute edge of human desperation over $12,000. I was not going to become the very monsters I had just defeated. Instead of buying supercars, I bought 20 fully equipped state-of-the-art emergency medical vehicles. Instead of buying a mansion, I bought a massive abandoned warehouse in downtown Detroit and hired a premier construction firm to completely renovate it into a free community medical clinic. I established the Richard Thorne Community Health Foundation. I endowed the foundation with $40 million of the estate cash, ensuring it would run in perpetuity. The foundation was designed with one specific purpose. It covered the cost of emergency ambulance transport and critical care co-pays for working-class families who were drowning in medical debt. I made sure that no son or daughter in this city would ever have to choose between burying their father and losing their home. I kept enough money to buy a modest, comfortable house and secure my own financial independence. I did not quit my job. I took a position as the Chief Medical Operations Director for the foundation. I put my paramedic uniform back on and I went to work every single day, knowing I was building a legacy that actually mattered. I had walked into a cemetery as a broken, humiliated man with no money and no hope. I had walked out as the master of my own life. I was no longer the family loser. I was the man who had taken their vicious cruelty and turned it into salvation for thousands of people. My father played the longest, most brilliant game of chess I have ever witnessed. He knew that true wealth is never measured by the label on your suit or the car in your driveway. True wealth is measured by what you do when you think nobody is watching. The greatest legacy my father left me was not the $50 million sitting in a hidden bank vault. The greatest legacy he left me was the power to see through the masks. He gave me the strength to stand tall when the entire world was trying to force me to my knees. He taught me that sometimes the people who share your blood are the first ones who will bleed you dry and sometimes the smallest. Most pathetic-looking gift holds the key to your absolute freedom. If you are listening to this right now and you are standing at rock bottom, do not give up. If people are laughing at your struggles or mocking your honest hard work, let them laugh. They are only exposing their own emptiness. Keep building your foundation in silence. The truth always comes to light, and the people who look down on you today might just be standing on ground that is about to completely collapse. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the underdog always has a chance to win. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you had to cut toxic people out of your life to find your own success. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about family secrets, ultimate justice, and the incredible moments that change everything. Thank you for listening. Keep fighting, keep standing. I will see you in the next video.